the single most important military aircraft ever shot down. There are thousands of aircraft that have fallen from the skies throughout history, each with its own story of courage, tragedy, and fate. Yet, among all those wrecks scattered across battlefields and oceans, one downing stands above the rest, not for the number of lives lost, but for how it changed the course of history. This is the story of the single most important military aircraft ever shot down. The date was May 27, 1941, and the world was deep in the chaos of World War II. The mighty German battleship Bismarck, pride of the Kriegsmarine, was tearing through the North Atlantic. It had already sunk HMS Hood, the Royal Navy's most famous battlecruiser, killing over 1,400 sailors. Britain was in shock. Winston Churchill gave a simple, furious order: sink the Bismarck. But there was a problem. Bismarck was fast, heavily armored, and vanishing into the Atlantic fog. The Royal Navy had no idea where she was headed, and every hour she stayed hidden meant she might reach safety in France beyond the reach of British bombers. The fate of the Atlantic War suddenly depended on finding one ship in an ocean. Then came one aircraft, a slow, fragile ferry Swordfish biplane flying from the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal. Built of wood and fabric, it looked laughably outdated, more like something from World War I than the cutting-edge fighters and bombers of 1941. But on that cold, windswept evening, that little plane and its crew of 3 would make history. Flying low over the waves, buffeted by wind and flak, the Swordfish closed in on the Bismarck. Anti-aircraft guns filled the air with metal and fire, but the slow speed of the biplane, ironically, made it harder to hit. The crew released a torpedo, which streaked through the water and struck the Bismarck's stern. At first, it seemed like just another hit, damage, but not fatal. Then the incredible happened. The torpedo jammed Bismarck's rudder. The ship could no longer steer. It began to circle helplessly in the Atlantic, turning itself into a sitting target. In that moment, the war at sea changed. Bismarck, the terror of the Atlantic, was crippled, unable to escape, unable to maneuver. The next morning, British battleships closed in and unleashed a storm of shells. Within hours, the pride of Nazi Germany was gone, sinking beneath the waves, taking over 2,000 sailors with her. And all because one ancient biplane had landed a single, lucky, perfectly timed strike. Some might argue other aircraft were more important. Perhaps the American U-2 spy plane shot down over the Soviet Union in 1960, which sparked an international crisis and nearly derailed Cold War diplomacy. Or the Japanese plane carrying Admiral Yamamoto in 1943, when U.S. cryptographers intercepted his flight plan and P-38 fighters ambushed him, killing the man who had masterminded Pearl Harbor. That event devastated Japanese morale. But the Swordfish strike on Bismarck stands apart for what it represented. It was the turning point of the Battle of the Atlantic, a campaign that decided whether Britain would live or starve. If Bismarck had escaped, German surface raiders might have regained dominance over Allied shipping, strangling supplies from America. Britain might have faced even darker days before D-Day was even possible. That one torpedo, fired by a crew who probably expected to die, ensured that didn't happen. So what made this aircraft, this flimsy biplane, the most important ever shot down? Because, ironically, it did get shot down. Many Swordfish didn't survive their missions. They were slow, they were obsolete, and they were slaughtered in dozens of attacks throughout the war. But in this single case, that frail machine carried the weight of empires on its wings. It's a powerful reminder that technological superiority doesn't always decide history. Courage, timing, and sheer willpower often do. The ferry Swordfish was outmatched by everything it faced, yet it delivered the strike that shifted naval power in the Atlantic. When the Bismarck sank, Britain's sailors cheered. Churchill, upon hearing the news, simply said, "The Bismarck is sunk." Behind that simple sentence lay the result of thousands of miles of pursuit, hundreds of lives, and the bravery of a handful of airmen flying a machine that should have been in a museum. The Swordfish that disabled the Bismarck didn't survive the war. It was later destroyed, like so many others, during training or routine operations. Yet its legacy is immortal. Its story lives on as a symbol of how even the humblest tools, when wielded by brave hands, can alter the destiny of nations. So when we ask, what is the single most important military aircraft ever shot down? The answer isn't the fastest jet or the most advanced bomber. It's the slow, fragile, almost forgotten biplane that crippled a battleship and changed the war at sea, the Fairey Swordfish, a wooden relic that reminded the world that courage can fly, even with canvas wings. When we think of turning points in war, our minds often go to great battles, brilliant generals, or monumental invasions. Yet sometimes, history turns not on the clash of armies, but on the aim of one crew, flying one fragile aircraft in one fleeting moment. The single strike delivered by a Fairey Swordfish biplane against the German battleship Bismarck in May 1941 was one such moment, a brief flash of courage and precision that forever altered the course of the war at sea. This wasn't a triumph of overwhelming power or of cutting-edge technology. It was the victory of determination, skill, and fate, all converging in the North Atlantic under a shroud of wind and rain. The story begins in the spring of 1941. Europe was burning. The German war machine had conquered most of the continent, and Britain stood alone against Hitler's seemingly unstoppable forces. The Atlantic Ocean had become Britain's lifeline, a vast, perilous highway through which food, oil, and weapons had to travel from America and the colonies. If that lifeline were severed, Britain would starve, and with it, all hope of liberating Europe would fade. The Germans knew this, and so the war at sea became a desperate struggle of survival. German U-boats hunted merchant ships by the dozens, and above them lurked an even greater menace, the surface raiders, the mighty warships of the Kriegsmarine. None inspired more fear than one name, Bismarck. The Bismarck was not just a battleship. She was a floating fortress, the embodiment of German engineering and naval ambition. Over 50,000 tons of steel, 8 massive 15-inch guns, thick armor, and an aura of invincibility. To the British public, already reeling from Blitz bombings and the fall of France, the appearance of Bismarck in the Atlantic was like a nightmare come to life. She was faster than most ships that could outgun her, and more powerful than most ships that could catch her. She was designed for one purpose: to break the British blockade, destroy convoys, and strangle Britain's supply lines until the island nation collapsed. On May 24, 1941, the Bismarck proved her power. In the icy waters of the Denmark Strait, she met HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, a ship that symbolized British naval might for 2 decades. The confrontation lasted mere minutes. A shell from Bismarck found its mark, and Hood exploded in a cataclysmic fireball, taking 1,415 men down to the cold sea. Only 3 survived. The news hit Britain like a thunderclap. The nation mourned, but the mood quickly hardened into fury. Prime Minister Winston Churchill's words echoed through the Admiralty: "Sink the Bismarck." It wasn't a request, it was an order that carried the weight of an empire. From that moment, the North Atlantic became a hunting ground. Every available British ship was thrown into the chase. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers scoured the vast gray expanse of ocean, desperately seeking a single enemy warship among thousands of square miles of water. But Bismarck was elusive. After the battle with Hood, she slipped into the fog, her crew determined to reach occupied France, where she would be safe under Luftwaffe protection. If she made it, she could return to strike again and again, not crippling the Atlantic convoys that kept Britain alive. Time was running out, and the Royal Navy knew it. The ocean is a merciless place to play hide and seek. Hours turned into days. The British ships burned precious fuel as they crisscrossed the Atlantic. The tension aboard was unbearable. Every sighting report, every flicker on the radar could mean salvation or disappointment. The stakes could not have been higher. Then, on May 26th, a stroke of fortune arrived. A Coastal Command aircraft spotted Bismarck. She was less than 700 miles from the French coast. The British fleet was scattered and far behind, but one weapon still had a chance: the aircraft carrier HMS Ark Royal and her squadron of Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers. If the word bomber conjures up images of sleek modern aircraft, the Swordfish was the exact opposite. Built of fabric and metal tubing, with an open cockpit and a top speed of barely 140 miles per hour, it was already obsolete before the war even began. Its pilots joked that it was so slow, enemy radar had trouble detecting it. To the outside world, the idea of these creaking biplanes attacking the most advanced warship in the world seemed suicidal. Yet these were the only aircraft available, and the men who flew them, young, determined, and fearless, didn't hesitate for a moment. The weather that evening was savage. The North Atlantic tossed and roared, waves rising like mountains and rain slashing across the deck. As the Swordfish crews prepared for takeoff, they knew what awaited them: a sky filled with flak, a sea filled with death. Still, one by one, the old biplanes struggled into the air, wings trembling in the gale. Among them was the aircraft flown by Lieutenant Commander John "Jock" Moffett. His target was the Bismarck, moving fast, zigzagging through the storm, its guns ready to blast any attacker from the sky. When the Swordfish approached, the Bismarck opened fire. The sky erupted in flames and steel. Tracers arced through the clouds, flak bursts bloomed around the fragile planes. It was a sight of terrible beauty. David against Goliath, fabric wings against fortress guns. The pilots dove low, so low their wheels nearly skimmed the waves, making themselves harder to hit. Moffat's plane was tossed by the wind, his vision blurred by spray and smoke, but he held steady. His observer shouted ranges and bearings. His gunner kept a nervous eye on the sea. Every second could be their last. Then came the moment. Moffat lined up his shot, dropped his torpedo, and pulled up hard. The weapon sliced into the water and sped toward the target. Seconds later, an impact. The torpedo slammed into Bismarck's stern. On board the German ship, a shudder ran through the steel giant. Damage reports came in quickly. Flooding aft compartments, some electrical failures. At first, it didn't seem catastrophic. The crew had trained for damage control. They were calm, efficient. But then the engineers realized the true horror. The rudder was jammed. The Bismarck could no longer steer properly. She was locked into a slow, useless circle. That one torpedo, launched from a frail biplane in the middle of a storm, had sealed the battleship's fate. Now Bismarck was no longer the hunter. She was the hunted. Through the night, destroyers harassed her with torpedoes and gunfire. At dawn, the great guns of HMS Rodney and King George Futh arrived, and the sea thundered with their barrage. The Bismarck fought back bravely, her crew firing until their last shells were spent. But she was outmatched and immobile. After more than an hour of relentless pounding, the once proud battleship rolled and sank beneath the waves. Out of over 2,200 men, only 114 survived. The sea swallowed the rest. When the news reached London, the reaction was electric. The sinking of Bismarck wasn't just a tactical victory, it was a symbolic one. Britain, isolated and under siege, had struck back at one of Hitler's most powerful weapons. The morale boost was enormous. Churchill, upon hearing the report, allowed himself a rare smile. His simple message, "The Bismarck is sunk," carried relief, triumph, and a sense that perhaps, just perhaps, the tide could turn. That single torpedo hit had changed the strategic balance of the Atlantic. The Bismarck had been designed to terrorize convoys, to give Germany control over the shipping lanes. Her loss not only removed that threat, but also demonstrated that surface raiders, no matter how formidable, were vulnerable in the age of air power. From that point onward, the German Navy never again attempted to send a major battleship into the Atlantic in the same way. The Tirpitz, Bismarck's sister ship, spent most of her career hiding in Norwegian fjords, hunted by Allied aircraft until she too was destroyed from the air. The lesson was clear. The era of the great battleship was ending, and the aircraft had taken its place as the true master of the seas. Yet, what makes this event so remarkable is how narrow the margin was between victory and disaster. If that torpedo had missed, if the rudder had not jammed, Bismarck might have reached France. She would have repaired, refueled, and returned to the Atlantic to continue her deadly work. Convoys would have suffered heavier losses, Britain's supplies would have dwindled, and the morale of the British people might have cracked. Instead, because of one strike from one obsolete aircraft, the tide of the naval war shifted in Britain's favor. It is hard to imagine a clearer example of how a single act of courage can change the destiny of nations. The men who flew those swordfish didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were professionals doing their duty. Many of them didn't live to see the end of the war. The Swordfish Squadron suffered heavy losses in later campaigns, their slow planes easy targets for enemy fighters. But their reputation was forever secured by that night over the Atlantic. Naval aviators across the world came to respect the courage it took to fly into a storm of gunfire in a plane slower than most cars. It became a defining symbol of British resilience, outdated technology perhaps, but wielded with unmatched determination. From a broader perspective, the attack on Bismarck marked the moment when the aircraft carrier replaced the battleship as the centerpiece of naval warfare. Before 1941, battleships had ruled the seas for nearly half a century. They were symbols of national pride, floating embodiments of power and prestige. But as Bismarck burned and sank, the Admiralty and the world saw that even the mightiest warship could be undone by a few small aircraft operating hundreds of miles away. The same lesson would soon be reinforced in the Pacific, where carriers and their aircraft decided the fate of entire fleets at Coral Sea and Midway. But it was the Swordfish and their fateful torpedo that had shown the world the future first. The Bismarck affair also showcased the incredible coordination and determination of the Royal Navy. The hunt stretched over thousands of miles, involved dozens of ships, and required constant communication and courage in brutal conditions. It was one of the most complex naval operations of the war, and every sailor, every pilot, every signalman who played a part contributed to the final victory. But at its heart, it all came down to that single improbable torpedo hit. A moment of human precision amid chaos. To appreciate just how extraordinary that shot was, one must imagine the conditions. The aircraft bouncing violently in the wind, instruments unreliable, visibility near zero. The target moving and turning through stormy seas, its gunners firing thousands of shells into the sky. The pilot had mere seconds to aim, to judge speed and distance, and to release at just the right angle for the torpedo to hit the vulnerable stern. That he succeeded was as much a testament to instinct and training as to luck. Even German officers later admitted that the torpedo hit was 1 in a million, the kind of shot that decides wars. History is full of grand battles and sweeping strategies, but it is also built on these small, decisive moments. The Fairey Swordfish's attack on Bismarck wasn't grand in scale, but its impact rippled through the rest of the war. It ensured the Atlantic lifeline remained open. It preserved Britain's capacity to fight. It inspired confidence that no enemy, no matter how formidable, was beyond reach. In that sense, the Swordfish's strike was more than a victory of arms. It was a victory of spirit. As years passed, the world moved on. New wars came, new aircraft were built, and new generations of pilots took to the skies. Yet the story of the Swordfish and the Bismarck remained etched in the annals of naval history. Museums display the remains of those biplanes today, their fabric and wood carefully preserved, their slow engines silent reminders of an age when bravery mattered more than speed. Veterans who survived the attack would later speak not of glory, but of the sheer terror and determination of that night. The freezing air, the roar of the guns, the knowledge that they might never return. They spoke of the strange stillness after the torpedo dropped, when all they could do was hope it would hit. For those who study history, it stands as a lesson in the unpredictable nature of warfare. No plan, no machine, no empire is invincible. Sometimes fate hinges on one torpedo, one pilot, one decision made in the chaos of battle. The Swordfish strike reminds us that even the smallest forces can bring down giants. It is the essence of what makes history so human, the idea that courage, timing, and chance can combine to change the world. That is why, when we speak of the most important aircraft ever shot down, or the most significant in history, we remember the Fairey Swordfish. Because its success didn't come from design superiority or numbers, but from the sheer willpower of its crew. It wasn't a weapon of dominance, but a tool of desperation, used by men who refused to give up. And through that refusal, through that single perfect strike, they helped secure the future of the free world. War has always been a contest of machines, of who can build faster, strike harder, and endure longer. But beneath every gleaming aircraft and every thundering tank lies something no blueprint can measure: the human spirit. The Fairey Swordfish, an outdated biplane that flew into history against the mighty Bismarck, stands as the purest proof that courage, not technology, decides the fate of battles. It was slow, fragile, and by every logical measure, obsolete. Yet when the world's future balanced on the edge of survival, it was this fragile relic and the men inside it who dared to do the impossible. The story of their flight is not merely about war, it's about belief, duty, and the enduring truth that machines don't win wars. People do. By 1941, aviation had evolved into the age of power and speed. The world's skies were filled with metal, Spitfires and Messerschmitts, Heinkels and Hurricanes, sleek, roaring symbols of industrial might. In contrast, the fairy Swordfish looked like a relic from another era. Its fabric-covered wings, open cockpit, and radial engine belonged more to the Great War than to the brutal, mechanized struggle raging across Europe. It could barely reach 140 miles per hour in perfect weather, and its defensive armament was laughably small, a single machine gun. Pilots who trained on it often joked that it was slower than the seagulls that followed their carriers. But jokes turned to silence when they took off into the dark, cold air of the North Atlantic, knowing that speed wouldn't save them from anti-aircraft fire. The Swordfish's mission against the Bismarck in May 1941 was not just a desperate gamble, it was an act of faith. Faith in their shipmates who had died aboard HMS Hood, faith in the Royal Navy's call to duty, and faith in themselves, that somehow, in a storm of iron and fire, they could make a difference. The pilots who flew those biplanes weren't equipped with radar or modern targeting systems. They relied on instinct, training, and teamwork. The unspoken trust between pilot, observer, and gunner that bound them closer than family. Theirs was a bond forged not in comfort, but in shared peril. Every flight over the ocean was a brush with death, every mission a test of nerves and endurance. When HMS Ark Royal received the order to launch its Swordfish squadrons, the weather was appalling. Winds howled, rain lashed across the deck, and waves crashed over the bow of the carrier. The steel runway heaved and tilted beneath the planes, threatening to fling them into the sea before they even took off. The crews could have waited for calmer weather, but time was a luxury they didn't have. The Bismarck was steaming toward France, just a day away from safety. Once within range of the Luftwaffe, she would be untouchable. Every minute counted. So despite the wind, despite the danger, the pilots climbed into their cockpits, their leather gloves stiff from the cold, their breath fogging in the night air. Engines roared, wings trembled, and one by one, the Swordfish were flung into the storm. Imagine for a moment what that felt like. The ocean below, black, endless, and unforgiving. The sky above, filled with rain and lightning. Your aircraft, open to the elements, vibrating with every gust of wind, the fabric skin rippling like a living thing. You know the target ahead of you is a battleship, bristling with guns, each one capable of tearing your fragile plane to shreds. You know that even if you hit your mark, the odds of surviving the return trip are slim. And yet, you fly on. Not because you expect glory, not because you seek medals, but because your comrades at sea depend on you. That is courage, the quiet, steady kind that doesn't shout or boast, but simply refuses to yield. As the Swordfish approached the Bismarck, the sea erupted in chaos. Anti-aircraft guns spat fire into the clouds, and tracer rounds stitched the sky with deadly light. The Bismarck's gunners were professionals. They had trained to destroy fast, modern aircraft, not slow-moving biplanes that seemed to float rather than fly. Ironically, that very slowness worked in the Swordfish's favor. The ship's targeting computers couldn't lock onto such low speeds. The shells exploded ahead or behind, missing by precious meters. But this was no comfort to the men in the air. They could see the explosions all around them, hear the thump of shockwaves against the thin fuselage, smell the acrid tang of cordite. Every second in that storm of flak was an eternity. In one of the attacking planes, Lieutenant Commander John Moffett and his crew focused on their run. They could see Bismarck below, a gray Titan cutting through the waves, its guns blazing, the sea around it alive with fury. Moffat dove low, almost skimming the surface, his hands gripping the controls with frozen determination. His observer called out bearings, his gunner fired bursts to distract the Germans. When the time came, Moffat leveled out, aimed his torpedo, and released it. He would later recall that moment as oddly peaceful. The sudden stillness after the drop, the sound of the engine, the feeling of emptiness as the weapon slipped away into the dark water. Then he pulled up, banking hard to escape the storm of fire. Seconds later, his torpedo struck the Bismarck's stern. A dull, deep explosion rolled across the ocean. On board the German ship, engineers scrambled to assess the damage. Within minutes, they discovered the truth. The rudder was jammed. The most powerful warship in the world could no longer steer. It was a wound from which it could not recover. That single torpedo dropped by a plane slower than a car had changed the entire battle. It was the triumph of courage over technology, of heart over hardware. But courage is not just found in those who make the perfect shot. It's also found in those who don't come back. Many swordfish were lost in the war, their crews swallowed by the sea, their stories forgotten in the vast ledger of conflict. Yet their spirit lived on in every man who took off knowing he might never land again. To fly an aircraft that was outdated before the war began, to face enemy fighters that could outrun and outgun you in every way, took a kind of bravery that few can imagine. They knew the odds, and they went anyway. The swordfish's success wasn't luck alone. It was the product of relentless training and discipline, the mastery of a machine's limitations. The pilots learned how to use the aircraft's slow speed to their advantage, how to skim waves to avoid radar, how to drop torpedoes at just the right angle and distance. They turned weakness into strength, clumsiness into cunning. That adaptability, that willingness to use what they had rather than lament what they lacked, was what set them apart. They embodied the fighting spirit of wartime Britain, a nation battered but unbroken, short on resources but rich in resolve. It's easy, in hindsight, to see their mission as heroic, but heroism rarely feels that way in the moment. For those men, the world had narrowed to the sound of the engine, the flicker of instruments, and the constant awareness of death nearby. They weren't thinking of history or destiny, only of the next wave, the next adjustment, the next second of survival. Courage, in its truest form, isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet endurance. It's the decision to keep flying when every instinct tells you to turn back. It's trust in your machine, your crew, and yourself. The swordfish pilots were ordinary men drawn into extraordinary circumstances. They came from small towns and cities, from farms and factories. Many had joined the Royal Navy before the war. Others volunteered after seeing their country under threat. They trained hard, often in primitive conditions, learning to navigate by the stars, to read the sea, to make split-second decisions. When they flew, they carried not just bombs and torpedoes, but the weight of a nation's hope. Every mission was a reminder that technology might shape the battlefield, but courage shapes the outcome. Even the German officers who fought against them were astonished by their bravery. Survivors from the Bismarck later described the attack as relentless and unnerving. They couldn't believe that the British would send such fragile planes against their ship, and even less that those planes would press home their attack through the wall of gunfire. They came to respect the swordfish crews, acknowledging that no machine could account for such determination. In a war often defined by machines, this mutual recognition of courage was a rare moment of shared humanity. The legacy of the swordfish goes beyond its technical achievements. It represents the enduring truth that technology alone doesn't guarantee victory. Throughout history, we see examples of advanced forces defeated by those with greater willpower, adaptability, and courage. The Greek phalanx fell to the Roman legion not because of better weapons, but because of better discipline. Napoleon's Grand Armée collapsed in Russia not for lack of skill, but for lack of endurance. And in the Atlantic, the Bismarck, a marvel of modern engineering, fell to a plane that looked like it belonged in a museum. Every one of these moments underscores the same lesson. Machines can fail, but the human spirit endures. In the months and years that followed, the swordfish continued to serve with distinction. It hunted submarines, laid mines, and supported convoys. Its slow speed, once a liability, made it perfect for low-altitude patrols. It could take off and land from tiny escort carriers that larger planes couldn't use. Again and again, it proved that courage and ingenuity could turn even an obsolete machine into a weapon of victory. When German sailors saw the distinctive silhouette of a swordfish overhead, they knew they were being watched by men who feared nothing, not even death itself. The story of the swordfish also challenges our modern obsession with technology. We live in a world that often believes progress is everything. Faster, smarter, newer must mean better. Yet history reminds us that courage, resourcefulness, and human connection are timeless advantages. In 1941, all the technology in the world couldn't save the Bismarck. It couldn't outthink or outfeel the men in those canvas wings. The same principle applies even now. The finest machines mean nothing without the will to use them, the discipline to master them, and the bravery to risk everything for something greater than oneself. When the war finally ended, many swordfish were scrapped or left to rot in hangars. The world had moved on to jets and radar, to missiles and nuclear submarines. But for those who remember the dark days of 1941, the image of the swordfish flying low over stormy seas remained a symbol of defiance. It captured something eternal, the moment when humanity's courage outshone the brilliance of its machines. Generations later, when historians look back at that night over the Atlantic, they don't see a technical triumph. They see a moral one. The swordfish was never meant to win that fight, but it did. Not because it was the best aircraft, but because it was flown by the best men. That victory reminds us that courage is not measured in horsepower or firepower. It's measured in heartbeats, in the moments when fear is present, but action follows anyway. Even now, the story resonates. In museums across the world, visitors stare at the preserved swordfish, its wings patched, its frame aged by time, and wonder how such a fragile craft could have brought down the Bismarck. The answer lies not in its design, but in the people who flew it. Theirs was a courage that defied reason, that ignored the odds.
Ladies and gentlemen, historians, aviation enthusiasts, and seekers of inspiration. Today, I want to take you back to a time when the sky was not a place of peace, but a battleground, when the outcome of wars was decided not only by brave pilots or powerful machines, but by the brilliant minds working quietly behind the scenes. This is the story of how one civilian, a man without wings or rank, changed the course of aerial warfare. It is the story of how his impossible trick made America's legendary P-38 Lightning almost untouchable. During World War II, the skies over Europe and the Pacific were dominated by relentless dogfights. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was already a marvel of engineering, twin engines, twin booms, and a top speed that made it a fearsome predator. But even great machines can have weaknesses. The P-38 had one, and it was deadly. At high altitudes, pilots reported that their controls would lock up in dives. The nose would drop, the aircraft would accelerate past the point of no return, and the pilot could do nothing but hope. Many never came back. The problem was aerodynamic compression. The airplane approached transonic speeds, and the air pressure around the control surfaces changed in unpredictable ways. For the first time, humans were touching the edge of the sound barrier, and no one fully understood how to tame it. Lockheed's engineers, test pilots, and even the US Army Air Forces were baffled. Every fix seemed to fail. For months, brilliant minds turned data into frustration. But then, a civilian engineer named Ben Kelsey brought in another civilian who would dare to do the unthinkable, a man named Kelly Johnson. Johnson was not a typical engineer. He wasn't satisfied with numbers that almost worked or explanations that almost made sense. He believed that innovation came from breaking the rules, carefully, but boldly. At the time, aerodynamic theory said that controlling shockwaves at high speed was impossible with the technology available. But Johnson refused to accept impossible. He began to think differently. Instead of trying to change the laws of physics, he tried to work with them. He studied how air flowed over wings, how control surfaces flexed, and how the shockwaves behaved during dives. What he proposed seemed absurd to many. A tiny dive recovery flap that could deploy under the wings when the plane entered a steep dive. On paper, it looked too simple to solve such a deadly problem. Critics said it wouldn't work. But Johnson was certain. The trick, he said, is not to stop the dive, it's to give the pilot control of it. When the first test flight was conducted, the P-38 entered a high-speed dive just as it had before. The airframe began to shake violently. Then, as the pilot extended the small flaps, something extraordinary happened. The nose lifted, the controls freed, and the aircraft pulled out safely. It worked. That tiny invention, that impossible trick, saved lives. It made the P-38 not just fast but controllable, even at the edge of the sound barrier. Soon, P-38 pilots began to dominate the skies again. They could dive faster, strike harder, and escape more easily than ever before. The aircraft that had once been feared by its own pilots became feared by the enemy. Johnson's innovation became one of the earliest successful applications of what we now call aerodynamic flow control. It was a glimpse into the future of supersonic flight. His idea paved the way for generations of aircraft that could push beyond old limits, from jet fighters to experimental X-planes and even spacecraft. But this story is not just about technology, it's about vision. It's about a civilian who stood at the edge of known science and said, "Let's go further." It's about a man who saw beyond blueprints and equations, who understood that progress is born not from certainty but from curiosity. It's about what happens when courage meets creativity, when one person refuses to let the word, "hope possible," end the conversation. The P-38 became one of the most iconic fighters of World War II. It escorted bombers across Europe, struck Japanese bases in the Pacific, and even carried out the daring mission that brought down Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. Each time a lightning roared into the sky, it carried with it the legacy of that one small, brilliant idea. Today, when we see advanced stealth fighters or hypersonic aircraft slicing through the stratosphere, we are witnessing the ripple of that same spark. The idea that innovation begins with a question, not an answer. So, what can we learn from this story? That heroes don't always wear uniforms. That genius sometimes hides in garages, laboratories, or drafting rooms. And that sometimes, one person's refusal to believe in impossible can tilt the balance of history. Kelly Johnson's Home Possible trick didn't just save pilots. It saved faith in the power of human ingenuity. It showed that every challenge, no matter how complex, carries within it the seeds of its own solution. If only we dare to look differently. Ladies and gentlemen, as we look to our own skis, of technology, of discovery, of dreams, let us remember that progress is not a straight line. It's a dive, sometimes terrifying, into the unknown. And like Johnson's flaps, what saves us is our ability to lift the nose, steady the course, and believe that there's always a way forward. Because history is not written by those who say, "can't be done." It's written by those who prove that it can. Thank you. When America entered World War II, its skies were filled with ambition, hope, and urgency. The United States Army Air Forces needed a fighter that could meet the demands of a new kind of war, one that stretched across continents and oceans, one that demanded speed, altitude, endurance, and precision. In response, Lockheed designed a plane that looked like nothing else in the sky, the P-38 Lightning, with its twin booms, central cockpit pod, and powerful twin engines. It was an aircraft that seemed born from the future. It was faster, more powerful, and more advanced than almost anything flying in those early years of the war. Pilots nicknamed it the fork-tailed devil, and enemies learned to fear its silhouette glinting in the sunlight. But for all its beauty and brilliance, the P-38 harbored a deadly secret, one that would threaten to undo everything it represented. At first, everything about the P-38 suggested success. Its twin Allison V-1710 engines could push it to speeds that earlier planes could only dream of. Its range made it the first American fighter capable of escorting bombers deep into enemy territory, and its firepower, 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon mounted in the nose, meant it could destroy enemy aircraft with a single devastating burst. Pilots who trained in it described the Lightning as powerful and graceful, like a predator built for speed and precision. It could climb higher, dive faster, and strike harder than almost any other fighter of its era. It seemed to be the very embodiment of American ingenuity and engineering mastery. Yet, as the first squadrons began to train and deploy, strange and terrifying reports began to filter back. Pilots returning from test flights spoke of a chilling phenomenon. When the P-38 entered a steep dive from high altitude, the controls would suddenly stiffen. The stick became immovable, as though frozen in place. The nose of the aircraft would drop, the speed would increase rapidly, and the pilot's desperate attempts to pull up were useless. The Lightning would plunge toward the Earth like a missile, accelerating faster and faster until it shattered on impact. Those who survived such dives described the sensation as being trapped inside a machine that had turned against them. A living nightmare from which there was no escape. At first, many assumed it was pilot error. Some thought the aircraft's controls had been misrigged or that its twin-engine layout created aerodynamic instability. Mechanics checked the hydraulic systems, engineers ran tests, and pilots tried different techniques. But nothing worked. Time and again, test flights ended in disaster. Brave men died trying to understand why an aircraft so advanced could behave so unpredictably. The problem seemed almost supernatural, as if the laws of flight themselves had turned hostile. The very thing that gave the P-38 its unmatched speed, its aerodynamic design, had also made it dangerously unstable in ways no one fully understood. The truth, as engineers would eventually learn, was that the Lightning was brushing against a frontier that no airplane had crossed before, the edge of the sound barrier. At extremely high speeds near 500 miles per hour, the air flowing over certain parts of the aircraft began to compress, creating shockwaves. This compressibility effect caused dramatic changes in lift and control. The tail surfaces, instead of responding smoothly to the pilot's commands, became locked in a downward force, pushing the nose even steeper. The harder the pilot pulled back on the controls, the more resistance he felt. It was a vicious, inescapable cycle. In the 1940s, the science of aerodynamics simply wasn't advanced enough to predict or manage such effects. No one had truly encountered compressibility before because no one had built a plane fast enough to experience it. For the young pilots of the Air Corps, it was a terrifying reality. In training manuals, instructors warned, "Do not exceed certain dive speeds." But in combat, when a pilot was fighting for his life, such warnings often went unheeded. A steep dive was a common maneuver to escape an enemy attack or to pursue a fleeing target. Yet with the P-38, a dive too steep meant a death spiral. Many promising aviators, men with families, dreams, and courage beyond measure, vanished in seconds, leaving only smoke and wreckage. For every life lost, questions mounted. Could the P-38 truly be trusted? Was its speed an advantage or a curse? Within the halls of Lockheed, frustration grew. Engineers pored over blueprints and data, searching for clues. The military applied pressure, demanding answers. The Air Forces needed the Lightning. Its range and speed were essential for upcoming missions in both Europe and the Pacific. But an aircraft that killed its own pilots was not a weapon. It was a liability. The reputation of the P-38 began to suffer. Rumors spread among pilots. If you dive in a Lightning, you dive in a Lightning. Morale faltered. Commanders hesitated to assign the aircraft to key missions. Some even proposed canceling production until a solution could be found. And yet, even amidst fear and tragedy, the P-38 remained too valuable to abandon. No other American fighter could match its long-range performance at that stage of the war. In the Pacific, where vast stretches of ocean separated islands, range was everything. The Lightning could escort bombers farther than any P-40 or P-47. It could reach Japanese bases that other fighters could not. It was the only plane that could make certain missions possible. Missions that could alter the balance of the war. But to unlock that potential, someone had to solve the mystery of its deadly dives. The U.S. Army Air Forces conducted exhaustive tests at Muroc Field in California, today known as Edwards Air Force Base. They built special instruments to measure the pressures and stresses on the airframe during high-speed dives. Test pilots risked their lives to gather data, diving to terrifying speeds while every nerve in their bodies screamed for them to pull up. Some of these men never returned. The data they recorded would later become the foundation of high-speed aerodynamics, but at the time it was only pain and peril. The reports were clear. At around Mach 0.68, airflow over the wings began to separate, forming shockwaves that disrupted control. But knowing the cause was not the same as finding a cure. Engineers tried modifying the tail, adjusting control cables, changing the shape of the wings, even adding balance weights. Each attempt seemed to fix one issue while creating another. The problem was more complex than any single mechanical flaw. It was a symptom of nature itself, the air reacting to speed in ways that human understanding had not yet caught up with. Some scientists even believed that no aircraft could ever safely fly faster than the speed of sound. They spoke of a sound barrier, an invisible wall that marked the limit of flight. To many, it seemed that the P-38 had simply reached that limit too soon. The psychological toll was heavy. Lockheed's engineers felt they had failed their pilots. The military feared losing confidence in one of its most advanced designs. Test pilots were torn between duty and dread. Every flight was an act of courage, a balance between science and survival. In the skies above California, where the desert winds whispered of broken wings and vanished heroes, the P-38's reputation hung in the balance. It is important to understand that the crisis of the P-38 Lightning was not just a mechanical issue, it was a crisis of faith in technology, in progress, and in the belief that human ingenuity could conquer the laws of nature. The 1940s were a time when aviation was still young. Only a few decades earlier, the Wright brothers had taken their first fragile flight at Kitty Hawk. Now, engineers were grappling with forces that had never been measured before. The Lightning's struggles reflected the growing pains of an entire generation of engineers pushing the boundaries of possibility. Every crash was a lesson written in courage and loss. In the midst of this turmoil, Lockheed's management faced mounting pressure from Washington. Reports of fatal crashes were drawing attention from military leadership, and there were whispers of canceling further orders. But one man within Lockheed refused to give up. He believed that every problem had a solution, no matter how complex. That man was a civilian engineer named Kelly Johnson, a brilliant and unconventional thinker whose genius would soon turn despair into triumph. Yet at this moment in history, before his breakthrough, the atmosphere was heavy with uncertainty. In the hangars of Burbank, where mechanics worked under the California sun, you could almost feel the tension in the air. Engineers walked among the partially assembled fuselages, studying every rivet and seam. Pilots stood near the aircraft they both loved and feared, talking quietly about the ones who hadn't made it back. Flight logs bore the names of the lost. Letters were sent to families. The P-38, the Lightning, was a marvel, but it was also a mystery. It was a bird that could soar higher than any other, but it sometimes refused to come back down safely. This was the moment when innovation was tested not by resources, but by resolve. America needed the Lightning, and the Lightning needed saving. The enemy was advancing, the skies were contested, and the clock was ticking. Every day without a solution meant more lives at risk and more missions in jeopardy. The very fate of air superiority in two theaters of war rested on the ability to fix one deadly flaw. And so, in the crucible of war, under the shadow of loss, the story of the P-38's crisis became a story of human determination. It was the prelude to a transformation that would redefine aviation itself. The Lightning's problem was not just a mechanical puzzle. It was the edge of discovery, a boundary between what was known and what could be learned. And on the other side of that boundary waited the man and the idea that would make America's P-38s almost untouchable. In every great crisis, there arises a figure who refuses to bow to failure. Someone who looks at the same facts as everyone else, but sees something different. When the P-38 Lightning stood on the brink of disaster, when engineers and pilots alike began to doubt whether the aircraft could be saved, that figure appeared in the form of a quiet but fearless civilian engineer named Clarence Kelly. Johnson. His name would later become legendary in aviation, but in those early years of the 1940s, he was simply an unorthodox thinker working at Lockheed, a man whose mind seemed to race faster than any aircraft he could design. Johnson didn't wear a military uniform. He didn't command squadrons or salute superiors. His weapon was imagination, and his battlefield was the drawing board. At the time, Lockheed Aircraft Company was a hive of restless energy. The war had transformed it from a modest California manufacturer into one of America's most vital engines of innovation. Its engineers worked long hours under the glare of fluorescent lights, surrounded by the smell of oil and metal, sketching, testing, and rebuilding prototypes in an endless cycle of trial and error. Each new design promised victory, each failure carried the weight of lives lost. Among these men, Kelly Johnson stood apart. He was young, outspoken, and utterly unwilling to accept limits. His colleagues described him as both brilliant and infuriating, a man who argued fiercely, but always with purpose. When others said something could not be done, he didn't dismiss them. He simply went off to prove them wrong. Johnson had already made his mark before the P-38 crisis began. He had been instrumental in refining earlier Lockheed models, earning a reputation for intuitive genius. He believed that good engineering was not just about numbers. It was about understanding how things wanted to work. To him, an airplane was almost alive, a thing of balance and beauty. He spoke often about listening to the airplane as though machines had voices. That approach made him unconventional, even eccentric. But it also made him one of the few people capable of tackling the Lightning's mysterious and deadly flaw. When reports of fatal dives began reaching Lockheed's engineering department, Johnson paid close attention. While others focused on mechanical explanations, hydraulic failures, structural weaknesses, or pilot error, he sensed something deeper. He suspected the P-38's problem wasn't in its parts, but in the invisible forces around it. He read every report, studied every crash analysis, and pored over the limited aerodynamic data available. What he found was both alarming and exhilarating. The P-38 was entering speeds and pressures that no wind tunnel on Earth could accurately replicate at that time. In a sense, the airplane was exploring territory beyond human understanding. To most engineers, that was terrifying. To Kelly Johnson, it was an invitation. He began to consider the possibility that the P-38's control lock was not a failure of design, but a symptom of success, that the aircraft had become so fast it was brushing against the limits of physics. The idea was radical. In 1941, the term compressibility was only beginning to appear in scientific journals. The concept that air could behave differently at near sonic speeds was not yet fully accepted. Many believed the sound barrier was an unbreakable wall, that approaching it would cause any aircraft to disintegrate. But Johnson refused to be intimidated by theory. He believed that nature could be understood if one was clever enough to ask the right questions. He spent long nights in Lockheed's design office, working on sketches by hand, calculating airflow patterns, and testing small-scale models. He often clashed with company executives who worried about costs and timelines. He was known to storm out of meetings, muttering that bureaucracy killed more ideas than physics ever could. Yet beneath his fiery temper was a fierce sense of responsibility. Every pilot who died in a P-38 weighed on him personally. He took it as a personal failure that his creation, an airplane meant to protect lives, had instead taken them. He was determined to fix it, no matter how long it took. Johnson's leadership style was as unconventional as his mind. He gathered a small group of trusted engineers, a team that would later become the foundation of his legendary Skunk Works division, and set them to work in a separate, isolated part of the factory. There, away from corporate distractions, he encouraged them to experiment freely. He imposed one rule above all others: speed. Be quick, be quiet, and be on time, he would say. He believed that innovation thrived in small teams with direct communication. No committees, no red tape, just pure focus. This approach was revolutionary in an era dominated by rigid military oversight and slow bureaucratic processes. As the team studied the P-38's high-speed dives, Johnson proposed a daring hypothesis. What if, instead of fighting the airflow changes, they could find a way to work with them? Perhaps the answer was not to redesign the entire aircraft, but to find a small, clever adjustment that could restore balance in the midst of chaos. It was an idea rooted in both simplicity and elegance, hallmarks of Johnson's genius. While others imagined large mechanical overhauls, he looked for a subtle trick that could make the airplane listen to its pilot again, even when the air screamed around it. This mindset, the refusal to accept the impossible, defined Kelly Johnson's entire career. When Lockheed test pilots warned him that the Lightning's dives were uncontrollable, he didn't dismiss their fear. Instead, he rode in the chase planes himself, observing every movement. He wanted to see the danger with his own eyes. He understood that real progress required risk, and that true innovation could not happen from behind a desk. His hands-on approach inspired trust among pilots, who came to see him not as a detached engineer, but as one of them, a man willing to share their peril in the pursuit of safety. As he dug deeper into the aerodynamic mysteries of the Lightning, Johnson also faced skepticism from higher authorities. Some within the Air Corps believed the P-38 was simply too advanced for its time, that the problem could never be solved without slowing the aircraft down or redesigning it entirely. Slowing it down would have meant giving up its greatest strength, speed. To Johnson, that was unacceptable. If it can fly that fast, he once said, then we can make it safe at that speed. Those words captured the essence of his philosophy: progress must never retreat from possibility. He began experimenting with small model wings in Lockheed's test facilities, adjusting their shapes and angles to observe airflow patterns. He consulted aerodynamicists, mathematicians, and even university researchers, searching for patterns in the chaos of data. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. The problem lay not in the wings themselves, but in how the airflow changed around the tail when shockwaves formed at high speeds. The nose dropped, the center of lift shifted, and the tail surfaces lost authority. The plane was, quite literally, being forced downward by the invisible hand of compressed air. To most engineers, that revelation was disheartening, a confirmation that the laws of physics were simply unbeatable. But to Kelly Johnson, it was a roadmap. If he couldn't prevent the shockwave from forming, perhaps he could give the pilot a new tool to counteract it. What if a small device could alter the flow of air, just enough to restore control during a dive? He sketched, erased, and redrew until an idea began to form. Not a major redesign, not a massive modification, but a subtle aerodynamic trick. It would be small, elegant, and counterintuitive. Exactly the kind of idea everyone else would call impossible. But before that breakthrough came, Johnson's battle was not just technical, it was also psychological. Within Lockheed, some doubted his obsession. Military officials demanded quick answers and time was running out. The war was intensifying and every unsolved issue meant more casualties in the field. Johnson worked tirelessly, often sleeping on a cot in his office. He refused to let failure dictate the fate of the Lightning. His confidence inspired those around him. Kelly never told us what couldn't be done. One engineer later recalled, he told us what had to be done, and expected us to find a way. That mentality, the refusal to accept defeat, transformed Lockheed's culture. It set a precedent for every future project the company would undertake, from jet fighters to spy planes. Johnson's team began to embody a spirit of relentless innovation. They approached every problem not as a barrier, but as an opportunity to learn. When the wind tunnels couldn't simulate transonic airflow, they built their own test rigs. When data was scarce, they invented new instruments. Every obstacle became a stepping stone. At the same time, Johnson maintained an extraordinary connection with the pilots who risked their lives in his creations. He believed that no amount of theory could replace first-hand experience. He talked to them, listened to their fears, and treated their feedback as gospel. Many of them were barely out of their 20s, men who carried both courage and vulnerability in equal measure. They trusted Johnson because he respected them. In return, they gave him insights that no laboratory could provide. Their courage became the raw material of his innovation. Eventually, his determination began to draw attention from the top brass of the Army Air Forces. They saw in Johnson not just a problem solver, but a visionary, someone who could think beyond the present. His reputation grew rapidly, though he never sought fame. For him, success was measured not in accolades but in results, in the roar of engines and the survival of pilots. Every time a P-38 took off, he felt personally responsible for its fate. Every safe landing was a victory. Every loss a lesson. Kelly Johnson's refusal to accept impossible was more than a personality trait, it was a philosophy of life. He believed that problems only remained impossible until someone found the courage to challenge them. In a time when science was still catching up to the realities of high-speed flight, he dared to think beyond equations. He combined intuition with experimentation, theory with audacity. His genius lay not just in his intellect, but in his attitude, a belief that the solution to every mystery was already out there, waiting for the right mind to see it. The story of how one civilian engineer looked at tragedy and saw opportunity is one of the most inspiring chapters in aviation history. Before Johnson's breakthrough invention would make the P-38 untouchable, his courage to stand alone against doubt, fear, and accepted limits became the engine of progress itself. At a time when others saw the Lightning's flaw as the end of its story, Kelly Johnson saw it as the beginning of discovery. That conviction, that relentless faith in human ingenuity, would soon change the course of the war and redefine what mankind believed was possible in the skies. When Kelly Johnson and his team at Lockheed finally arrived at their breakthrough, it did not emerge in a moment of lightning bolt inspiration. It came slowly, born out of sleepless nights, piles of sketches, test failures, and an unyielding belief that a simple idea could solve a deadly problem. The P-38 Lightning's curse, its uncontrollable dives, had claimed lives, shaken confidence, and threatened to erase one of America's most promising aircraft from the skies. Every test flight seemed to reinforce the same grim pattern. Once the aircraft entered a high-speed dive, the controls would freeze, the tail would lock, and the pilot would be helpless. No amount of strength or training could overcome the forces that pinned the stick forward. But in the mind of Kelly Johnson, the answer was hiding in plain sight. The P-38 didn't need a complete redesign, it needed a way to change the conversation with the air itself. In those tense months of experimentation, Johnson's small team worked in isolation, stripped of bureaucracy and surrounded by urgency. They tested scale models, studied airflow diagrams, and built crude mock-ups out of wood and aluminum. Each test brought them closer to the truth. The air that flowed around the Lightning's wings behaved normally until it reached very high speeds. Then, it suddenly changed character. The flow of air would separate from the surface of the wing, forming invisible shockwaves that shifted the center of lift backward. This aerodynamic shift forced the nose downward and increased the dive even further. The faster the plane went, the stronger the downward push became. Pilots who tried to pull back only made matters worse. The harder they fought, the faster they fell. To understand the scale of this problem, one must imagine what those pilots experienced. As the P-38 plunged toward the Earth at speeds over 500 miles per hour, the airframe trembled violently. The controls became as rigid as stone, the cockpit shook, gauges blurred, and the roar of the engines merged with the scream of the wind. A pilot could see the ground racing upward, knowing that at any second the aircraft might shatter. In those final moments, survival depended on luck, not skill. That was the horror Johnson was determined to eliminate. He believed that if he could just restore a small measure of control during that critical phase of flight, pilots would have the power to recover. The question was how. Most engineers were trapped by conventional thinking. They assumed that only a large redesign, perhaps a bigger tail or thicker wings, could counteract the forces of compressibility. But Johnson saw the problem differently. He did not want to fight the laws of aerodynamics, he wanted to cooperate with them. He asked himself a deceptively simple question. If the airflow wants to push the nose down, can we give the airplane a small helping hand to push it back up? That single thought sparked the beginning of his revolutionary idea. Johnson began to experiment with small flaps located underneath the wings, just ahead of the main landing gear. These would not be ordinary flaps like those used during takeoff or landing. They would be small, strong panels that could deploy only when the airplane was in a steep dive. When extended, they would slightly change the distribution of lift under the wings, shifting the aerodynamic forces forward and countering the nose-down moment that caused the aircraft to lock. It was an elegant solution, one that used the airplane's own airflow to restore balance. The concept seemed too simple to be true. Many at Lockheed dismissed it at first, calling it a gimmick. Military officials, desperate for results but wary of unproven ideas, were skeptical. How could a small metal flap possibly solve a problem that had killed dozens of pilots? Johnson faced intense scrutiny, yet he remained unmoved. He built models, ran calculations, and presented his findings with calm authority. He explained that the flaps would not need to generate massive lift. They only needed to alter the pressure distribution enough to let the tail regain control. It was not brute force that would save the Lightning, it was finesse. The first prototype of these so-called dive recovery flaps was built quickly and installed on a test P-38. The test pilot chosen for the mission was one of Lockheed's best, a man accustomed to danger but aware of the risks. The world held its breath as the Lightning climbed into the sky over the California desert. Engineers on the ground watched with binoculars as the silver aircraft climbed, leveled, and then tipped forward into a dive. The engines screamed. The speed climbed. The aircraft began to tremble, the familiar warning signs of compressibility. Everyone expected the same outcome they had seen before. But then, at a predetermined altitude, the pilot extended the small flaps. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, miraculously, the nose began to rise. The stick loosened. The pilot pulled out smoothly from the dive and leveled off. The P-38 had recovered. When the pilot landed, the ground crew rushed to him. His face was pale, his hands trembling, but his voice was steady. "It works," he said simply. Those two words marked the turning point in the Lightning's history. The impossible had been made possible. The news spread quickly through Lockheed and the Air Corps. Engineers who had nearly lost faith found themselves astonished by the simplicity of the solution. What had eluded the world's best aerodynamicists turned out to be a matter of inches of metal and moments of timing. Kelly Johnson's flaps transformed the P-38 from a dangerous prototype into one of the safest high-speed aircraft of the war. For the first time, pilots could dive at extreme speeds and still pull out under control. They could use the Lightning's speed not as a liability, but as a weapon. Johnson's innovation soon became a triumph of practical genius. The dive recovery flaps were retrofitted to existing aircraft and built into all new P-38s rolling off the production line. Reports from combat squadrons began to change almost overnight. Pilots who once feared diving now used it as a tactical maneuver. Japanese and German fighters, which once relied on steep dives to escape pursuit, suddenly found that the P-38 could follow them down and emerge unscathed. Allied pilots gained a new confidence, knowing that their aircraft would not betray them. The sky, once a place of dread for Lightning crews, became a field of opportunity. The beauty of Johnson's idea lay not just in its effectiveness, but in its efficiency. It required no complex redesign, no major overhaul, and no expensive retooling. It was a perfect example of how insight could outweigh brute engineering. It was, quite literally, an impossible trick. One that seemed too clever to be real, yet worked flawlessly in practice. It was the kind of solution that redefined what it meant to be an engineer, not merely a builder of machines, but a problem solver guided by imagination. For the pilots, the difference was night and day. Before the invention of the dive flaps, every steep descent carried a whisper of death. Afterward, it became a source of power. Test pilots began to push the Lightning harder, exploring dives from greater altitudes, higher speeds, and tighter turns. Each time the flaps performed flawlessly. In one celebrated test, A P-38 equipped with the new system reached speeds that had previously been considered suicidal, yet it recovered as smoothly as if it had been flying level. Engineers who witnessed the flight later described the moment as watching the laws of nature change before our eyes. The United States Army Air Forces quickly approved the modification, and Lockheed began producing retrofit kits for units already in the field. Within months, Lightning squadrons from Europe to the Pacific had adopted the improvement. The change was so dramatic that it altered the reputation of the aircraft entirely. The P-38 was no longer the fighter that killed its own pilots. It was now the aircraft that could do what no enemy plane could match. It could dive faster, fly farther, and strike deeper. Its pilots, once cautious, became confident and daring. The Lightning's elegant twin-boom design, once feared as a flaw, now became a symbol of resilience. Behind all this success stood Kelly Johnson's unshakable faith in simplicity. He often said that every technical problem had an elegant solution if one was willing to look past complexity. His dive recovery flaps were a masterclass in that philosophy. They did not defy physics, they worked with it. They didn't overpower nature's forces, they redirected them. In that sense, his invention was not merely mechanical, it was philosophical. It embodied the idea that mastery comes not from domination, but from understanding. The significance of Johnson's possible trick extended far beyond the P-38 itself. The discovery that airflow could be manipulated to restore control at near sonic speeds opened an entirely new chapter in aerodynamics. Engineers studying the Lightning's behavior began to realize that the so-called sound barrier was not an unbreakable wall, but a threshold that could be crossed with the right design. The lessons learned from those dive flaps would later inform the development of jet aircraft, transonic fighters, and even the research planes that would one day break the speed of sound. In a very real sense, those small metal panels under the wings of the P-38 pointed the way toward the future of aviation. In wartime, however, the value of innovation is measured not in scientific papers, but in lives saved and battles won. With its newfound stability, the P-38 Lightning became one of the most formidable weapons in the Allied arsenal. It was the aircraft that intercepted Japanese communications and carried out the mission to shoot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor. It escorted bombers across Europe, struck enemy shipping in the Pacific, and became the personal mount of many of America's top aces. Every victory it achieved bore the unseen signature of Kelly Johnson's dive recovery flaps. Each successful dive, each narrow escape, each safe return from combat was a testament to the power of that small, ingenious idea. What made the story so extraordinary was not just that the flaps worked, but that they symbolized a deeper truth about innovation itself, that sometimes the greatest leaps forward come from those willing to look where others refuse to. While much of the world was still bound by old theories, Johnson dared to ask new questions. He believed that progress was a dialogue between imagination and reality, and his dive flaps were the perfect expression of that belief. In their simplicity lay a lesson that would echo through generations, that the solution to an impossible problem often lies in the smallest, most overlooked detail. When the war ended and the history of the P-38 was written, the dive recovery flaps were often described as a footnote in a long list of wartime innovations. But for those who lived it, the engineers who designed it, the pilots who tested it, and the soldiers who owed their lives to it, it was much more than that. It was proof that the human mind, armed with determination and curiosity, could outwit even the harshest laws of nature. It was proof that courage on the ground could save courage in the air. And it was proof that sometimes, a little piece of metal could carry the weight of a nation's hope. When the dive recovery flaps were finally perfected and fitted onto America's P-38 Lightnings, something extraordinary began to happen. What had once been an aircraft with a mixed reputation, admired for its speed and range but distrusted for its deadly dives, suddenly became the scourge of the skies. The same plane that had cost so many test pilots their lives was now saving them in combat, and not just saving them, but giving them a weapon unlike anything their enemies possessed. The transformation of the P-38 was not simply a technical success, it was a strategic turning point that reshaped the balance of air power in World War II. By 1943, the skies over Europe and the Pacific had become brutal battlegrounds. The Axis powers ruled vast stretches of airspace with veteran pilots and well-developed aircraft. The Japanese Zero was fast and agile, able to twist and turn like a bird of prey. The German Foch, Wolf and Messerschmitt fighters were powerful, sleek, and deadly. The Allies, meanwhile, were racing against time to develop machines that could match or surpass them. The P-38 Lightning had been one of those hopeful experiments. A twin-engine fighter unlike any other in the world. But despite its promise, it had nearly been grounded by its own aerodynamic flaws. That all changed when a civilian's so-called impossible trick turned the Lightning into one of the most feared aircraft in the war. Almost overnight, pilots who had once hesitated to fly the P-38 began to volunteer for it. They knew now that their aircraft could dive faster, climb higher, and fly farther than almost any fighter the enemy could field. It could cover enormous distances, escorting bombers deep into hostile territory where single-engine fighters couldn't go. It could chase down retreating foes who once relied on diving away for safety. It could strike, retreat, and strike again, all without losing control. That newfound confidence was a powerful force multiplier. The war in the air was not just about technology, it was about morale, belief, and daring. And the P-38 gave all three back to the Allied pilots. The change was especially dramatic in the Pacific theater, where long distances and open skies defined nearly every engagement. Before the Lightning's transformation, American pilots often found themselves outmaneuvered by Japanese Zeros, whose agility and tight turning radii made them almost impossible to match in dogfights. But the Zero had a weakness. It was lightly built, lacking armor and firepower compared to the robust American designs. The P-38, with its twin engines, heavy armament, and newly found control at high speeds, was perfectly suited to exploit that weakness. Instead of engaging in slow, twisting fights where the Zero excelled, Lightning pilots used their speed and altitude to dive, attack, and climb away before the enemy could react. The boom and zoom tactic, once too dangerous because of the Lightning's dive control problem, became its deadliest weapon once the dive recovery flaps were installed. Reports from the Pacific began to pour in. Lightning squadrons were cutting through enemy formations like a hot blade through fabric. Japanese pilots, who had once mocked the P-38 for its size and stiffness, suddenly found themselves helpless against it. The Lightning's guns, 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20 cannon mounted in the nose, were devastating in their accuracy. Unlike other fighters whose guns were mounted in the wings and required convergence at a specific range, the Lightning's centerline armament allowed it to strike with deadly precision at long distances. Pilots learned to fire in brief, controlled bursts, and often, a single pass was enough to send an enemy spiraling into the sea. One of the most iconic demonstrations of the P-38's new capabilities came in April 1943, in a mission that changed the course of the Pacific War. American intelligence had intercepted a Japanese communication revealing that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, would be flying from Rabaul to Bougainville on an inspection tour. It was an opportunity the Allies could not ignore. 16 P-38 Lightnings equipped with extra fuel tanks and led by Major John W. Mitchell were assigned to intercept him. The mission required a 1,000-mile round trip, far beyond the range of any other fighter of the time. Flying low over the ocean, the Lightnings arrived precisely on schedule, appearing like silver ghosts over the jungle canopy. When Yamamoto's transport and escort fighters appeared, the Americans pounced. The Japanese Zeros tried to dive and escape, but the Lightnings followed them down, unflinching, controlled, and deadly. The possible dive that had once doomed the P-38 was now the maneuver that sealed its enemy's fate. Within minutes, Yamamoto's plane was shot down. The mission, Operation Vengeance, was a flawless execution of planning, skill, and technological ingenuity. It proved not only the Lightning's range and precision, but also that its new control systems made it capable of the most demanding missions of the war. From that moment, the P-38 became a symbol of reach, power, and reliability. Across the Pacific, it escorted bombers on long-range raids, intercepted enemy reconnaissance planes, and destroyed supply convoys with surgical precision. Pilots like Richard Bong, Thomas Magaya, and Charles Lindbergh, who flew combat missions as a civilian advisor, used the Lightning to devastating effect. Bong and Magaya became America's top aces, scoring dozens of victories, many of them achieved in head-on dives that would have been impossible before Kelly Johnson's innovation. Lindbergh, once the face of civilian aviation, returned to the skies to train young pilots in how to extend the range and performance of the P-38. He was astonished by how the dive flaps made the aircraft not only safer but smoother and more responsive. It was, he said, like taming lightning itself. The same transformation unfolded over Europe. In the Mediterranean, P-38s led precision strikes against German supply lines and airfields in North Africa and Italy. In the cold skies over northern Europe, they escorted bombers deep into German territory, where the Luftwaffe's most experienced aces waited. Before the Lightning's improvement, many bomber crews dreaded those missions. Single-engine fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt or P-51 Mustang could not always cover the full distance. But the twin-engine P-38 could. Its long-range and high-altitude performance meant that bomber formations were never alone. The Luftwaffe soon learned that attacking a formation protected by Lightnings was a costly mistake. The P-38 could dive after interceptors, fire accurately from long range, and return to altitude before the enemy could counterattack. This newfound control in dives gave the Lightning pilots a sense of invulnerability. It also changed the tactics of the air war itself. Where once the Allies had to avoid steep dives for fear of losing aircraft, now they used them as deliberate maneuvers to break enemy formations, attack ground targets, or evade pursuit. The psychological shift was immense. Every pilot knew that when things went wrong, when an enemy locked onto their tail or flak filled the sky, they could push the nose down and rely on their aircraft to bring them safely back out. That confidence turned good pilots into great ones, and great pilots into legends. The German Luftwaffe began to fear the sound of the twin-engine roar that announced the arrival of a Lightning squadron. They called it the Fork-tailed Devil, a name that captured both awe and terror. In air-to-air combat, the P-38 proved particularly effective against German bombers and reconnaissance aircraft. Its heavy armament and long loiter time allowed it to patrol for hours, hunting enemy planes at will. In ground attack roles, it became a precision strike weapon, capable of carrying bombs and rockets while maintaining the agility to escape at high speed. Every dive, every low-level attack, Every steep pursuit was made possible by the same, impossible, flaps that had once seemed like a desperate experiment. The impact rippled beyond tactics and battles. It reached the very heart of morale. For the first time, pilots trusted their machines completely. Maintenance crews worked with renewed pride, knowing they were tending to an aircraft that was changing the course of the war. Commanders could plan longer, deeper, riskier missions, confident that their pilots had the tools to return. Even the enemy began to recognize that the Lightning represented a new kind of challenge, an aircraft that could outfly, outfight, and outthink them. What makes this transformation so remarkable is that it was not achieved through brute force or massive redesign. It came from understanding a problem deeply enough to solve it elegantly. The dive recovery flaps did not make the P-38 stronger in muscle, they made it smarter in movement. That intelligence, that subtle harmony with the air, is what turned a flawed machine into a legend. And in doing so, the Lightning became more than just a plane, it became a symbol of American ingenuity. Its success reminded both the Allies and their enemies that the United States was capable of solving problems that others deemed unsolvable. Every time a P-38 thundered into the sky, it carried with it the spirit of innovation, the belief that no obstacle was truly impossible. That belief, more than any weapon or technology, was what ultimately turned the tide of the air war. By the final years of the conflict, the Lightning had become a fixture in every major theater. It flew reconnaissance missions over enemy territory, mapping invasion routes and photographing troop movements. It delivered devastating strikes against supply lines and industrial targets. It escorted bombers on raids deep into enemy heartlands, sometimes flying missions that lasted 8 or 9 hours. And at the heart of every one of those missions was a quiet piece of engineering brilliance. A small set of flaps that allowed the aircraft to do what no other could. To the men who flew it, the P-38 was more than a machine, it was a partner, a guardian, a weapon of precision and reliability. Pilots who once feared its high-speed dives now trusted it with their lives. And that trust, the bond between man and machine forged by innovation, helped shape the course of the war's outcome. The Lightning gave the Allies the ability to fight on their own terms, to strike where and when they chose, and to return home safely. It was the edge they needed in a war where every edge mattered. As historians later reflected on the air war, many agreed that the P-38's transformation marked one of the most dramatic reversals in aviation history. From a near failure to an icon of dominance, it represented everything the American war effort stood for: creativity, persistence, and the refusal to accept defeat. In every theater, in every campaign, the Lightning's shadow fell long and powerful. And behind that shadow was a single innovation, a civilian's brilliant, impossible trick that changed not just one airplane, but the entire course of aerial warfare. In the aftermath of World War II, when the skies over Europe and the Pacific finally fell silent, the men and machines that had once roared through those heavens became legends. Among them, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning stood apart, not just for its twin-boom silhouette or its unmatched combat record, but for the mind that had made its triumph possible. Kelly Johnson, the quiet civilian who had dared to attempt the impossible, left behind more than an aircraft. He left behind a philosophy, a way of thinking that would shape the next generation of aviation, space exploration, and engineering itself. His impossible trick, the dive recovery flaps that transformed the Lightning from a dangerous prototype into a world beater, was more than a mechanical fix. It was a declaration of faith in human ingenuity, a reminder that creativity and courage could bend even the hardest limits of nature. When the war ended, the Lightning's story became part of aviation folklore. Pilots spoke of it with reverence, mechanics with pride, and historians with awe. But for Johnson, the story was only beginning. He never saw himself as a hero or even as a genius. He saw himself as a problem solver, and that humility became the cornerstone of his legacy. In every design he touched, from the P-38 to the U-2 spy plane to the SR-71 Blackbird, Johnson carried forward the same spirit that had driven him to solve the P-38's deadly dive. He believed that every challenge, no matter how impossible it seemed, could be conquered through understanding, experimentation, and bold simplicity. Johnson's work on the P-38 had proven something vital, that one individual, even outside the military hierarchy, could alter the fate of a war through innovation alone. He wasn't a general or a politician. He wasn't flying missions or commanding squadrons. He was an engineer, a civilian surrounded by blueprints and wind tunnels, yet his fingerprints were on every victory the Lightning achieved. That realization sent ripples through the aviation world. It shattered the old notion that war-winning ideas had to come from the battlefield. Sometimes the most decisive breakthroughs came from quiet workshops and restless minds willing to challenge convention. The P-38's transformation was not just about physics, it was about the courage to imagine something new. When the dive recovery flaps first appeared on Johnson's sketches, many dismissed them as naive, even laughable. But Johnson understood something fundamental about innovation, that every great idea begins as an absurdity. The difference between genius and folly lies in persistence, and Kelly Johnson had persistence in abundance. He never accepted that good enough was truly good enough. For him, every design had to strive toward perfection, not just in performance but in elegance. He once said, "An engineer who doesn't believe in miracles isn't a very good engineer." That belief, more than any blueprint, defined his work. As the world rebuilt after the war, Johnson's reputation grew rapidly. The success of the P-38 gave him the freedom to lead his own experimental division within Lockheed, a small, highly secretive unit that would come to be known as the Skunk Works. From that unassuming workshop would emerge some of the most revolutionary aircraft in human history. The lessons Johnson learned from the P-38, simplicity, trust in small teams, and the courage to take risks, became the foundation of Skunk Works' philosophy. It was there that he and his engineers would design aircraft decades ahead of their time. The echoes of the P-38's innovation could be found in every project that followed. When Johnson created the U-2, the high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft that would fly over the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War, he faced challenges eerily similar to those he had conquered years before. Once again, he was pushing the limits of aerodynamics, crafting a plane that could soar higher and faster than anything else in existence, yet remain stable and controllable. The same meticulous attention to airflow, pressure distribution, and stability that birthed the dive recovery flaps now guided his hand as he shaped the U-2's impossibly thin wings. The lessons learned in the P-38's screaming dives were reborn in the U-2's silent ascents. Then came the SR-71 Blackbird, the ultimate embodiment of Kelly Johnson's genius. Capable of flying at over 3 times the speed of sound and at altitudes higher than 80,000 feet, it was an aircraft so advanced that even radar struggled to see it. And yet, beneath all its futuristic technology, one could still trace the DNA of the Lightning. The same elegant engineering, the same trust in the physics of flight, the same understanding that control at extreme speed required harmony, not brute force. The Blackbird, like the Lightning, danced on the edge of the impossible. It didn't fight the air. It flowed with it. But Johnson's legacy was not only written in metal and match numbers. It was written in people, in the generations of engineers and dreamers who learned from his example. He taught them that creativity demanded discipline, that boldness required humility, and that progress was born not from wealth or luck but from relentless curiosity. He believed in the power of small teams, in giving engineers direct control and accountability. His rules for Skunk Works became legendary. No bureaucracy, minimal paperwork, maximum trust. He understood that the same kind of focus that had saved the P-38 from disaster was only possible when talented people were allowed to think freely, act quickly, and believe deeply in their work. The ripple effects of Johnson's approach extended far beyond aviation. The mindset that powered the Skunk Works became a model for innovation across industries, from software to space exploration. It showed the world that revolutionary ideas are not born from vast committees, but from individuals willing to take ownership of the unknown. And that belief, rooted in the moment when a small flap on a World War II fighter changed the laws of flight, became one of America's greatest intellectual exports. Even decades later, pilots who had flown the P-38 during the war continued to speak of Johnson with reverence. Many credited him personally for their survival. Some had seen their friends perish in lightning dives before the invention of the recovery flaps. Others had pulled out of dives themselves, alive only because of his idea. To them, Johnson wasn't just an engineer. He was a guardian angel in coveralls, a man who had made their bravery possible. They often said that every P-38 carried 2 pilots, one in the cockpit and one invisible, sitting somewhere back at Lockheed with a pencil and an unbreakable imagination. The civilian who had once been mocked for his impossible trick eventually received the highest honors his nation could bestow. He earned the Collier Trophy, the Medal of Freedom, and countless other awards. But the recognition that meant most to him didn't come from politicians or generals. It came from the pilots themselves, from letters, handshakes, and quiet words of thanks. He often kept those letters folded in his desk drawer, more valuable to him than any medal. They were proof that his belief in the power of one idea, and one person, had made a difference. In time, historians came to see Kelly Johnson's work on the P-38 as the moment when engineering became as decisive a weapon as any bomb or bullet. The dive recovery flaps were a small piece of metal, yet their impact rippled through history. They symbolized a bridge between human intellect and mechanical might, proof that even in an age of destruction, creation could still lead the way. In that sense, Johnson's legacy transcended war itself. His work reminded the world that technology, when guided by vision, could serve humanity rather than destroy it. The civilian genius, as he was later called, embodied the best of the American spirit. He was self-taught, self-driven, and endlessly curious. He came from modest beginnings, yet his ideas reached the edge of the atmosphere. He lived by a code that valued simplicity, honesty, and courage. When asked late in life how he wanted to be remembered, he replied, "I just want to be remembered as someone who solved problems." But in truth, he did far more than that. He redefined what it meant to solve them. He showed that the frontier of possibility is not a place, it's a mindset. Today, every time a stealth jet slips, unseen through the clouds, or a spacecraft re-enters the atmosphere with precision, a faint echo of Johnson's thinking can be found in its design. The engineers who built those machines stand on the shoulders of his philosophy. That the hardest problems are often the simplest in disguise, that innovation begins with a question, and that courage is not limited to the battlefield. Kelly Johnson's courage was of a different kind. The courage to look at an unsolved problem and whisper, There's an answer here. We just haven't seen it yet. The legacy of the P-38's transformation lives on not only in the skies, but in the culture of invention it inspired. Museums around the world display the Lightning as a symbol of engineering triumph, a reminder of how a civilian's insight altered the course of a global war. Visitors stand beneath its silver wings and marvel at its sleek lines, unaware that the small panels beneath its wings, barely visible to the casual eye, once represented the boundary between life and death, between fear and mastery. They are reminded that history often turns not on the grand gestures of nations, but on the quiet brilliance of individuals. In classrooms and laboratories, the story of Kelly Johnson is told not as a tale of machines, but as a lesson in perseverance. It teaches young innovators that no obstacle is insurmountable, no idea too small to matter. It teaches that genius often wears ordinary clothes, and that greatness is measured not in fame, but in impact. It is the story of how one civilian, armed only with intellect and determination, made the impossible real, and in doing so, helped define the age of flight. The world that followed him, the world of jet engines, space travel, and stealth, owes a silent debt to that moment of inspiration during the darkest days of war. The dive recovery flaps of the P-38 were not just a technical invention, they were a statement of belief, that the human mind could always find a way forward, even when surrounded by chaos. And long after the last lightning faded from the sky, that belief continued to soar, higher and faster than any plane ever could. Ladies and gentlemen, fellow enthusiasts of history, innovation, and courage, today I invite you to travel back to a time when the skies over Europe were filled with thunder, courage, and invention. A time when every drop of fuel, every degree of octane, and every heartbeat of an engine could mean the difference between life and death. Our story begins in the dark, uncertain years of World War II. The Allies were struggling to gain control of the skies. Germany's Luftwaffe, powerful, disciplined, and technologically advanced, dominated the air. Their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 90s ruled the European theater with unmatched speed and precision. Allied bombers flying deep into enemy territory often never made it home. Escort fighters simply couldn't go the distance. And then came the North American P-51 Mustang, sleek, elegant, and fast. But early models had a flaw: their engines, designed for lower-grade fuel, couldn't fully unleash the aircraft's potential. The Mustang was good, but it wasn't yet great. The war was about to change that. Enter the 150-grade aviation fuel, a technological leap that turned good pilots into legends and good aircraft into demons of the sky. Developed through relentless Allied experimentation, this high-octane fuel was like adrenaline for engines. It enabled them to run at higher boost pressures, squeeze more power out of every cylinder, and transform raw machinery into a weapon of unprecedented speed and endurance. With 150-grade fuel coursing through their Merlin engines, the Mustangs roared to life in ways no one thought possible. Top speeds jumped from 437 miles per hour to an astonishing 490 miles per hour. That's not just a number, it was a declaration, a message to the Luftwaffe that the rules of aerial combat had changed forever. Imagine being a German pilot at 25,000 feet, scanning the horizon. For months, you've had the advantage. Your aircraft can dive faster, climb higher, escape with ease. But then, one morning, the sound in the distance is different, sharper, more menacing. You turn, and there it is, a silver streak, diving from the sun, closing the gap faster than anything you've seen. The P-51, fueled by 150-grade power, tears through the air like a demon unleashed. In seconds, it's on your tail. You pull hard, but it follows effortlessly. You dive, it dives faster. You climb, it climbs harder. For the first time, you are the hunted. The Germans never expected it. Their intelligence reports didn't believe the Americans could safely handle 100-fit octane fuel. Their scientists argued it would burn engines, melt pistons, or cause detonation. But Allied engineers, especially those in Britain and the US, proved them wrong. They pushed the chemistry, refined the additives, and tuned the engines until the results were nothing short of miraculous. This was more than a mechanical upgrade. It was a turning point in the psychology of war. Suddenly, Allied pilots, who had once flown with fear, felt a surge of confidence. They could escort bombers deep into Germany, fight off interceptors, and still have the power to come home. The long-range Mustang, now blazing through the skies at nearly 500 miles per hour, became the very symbol of Allied air supremacy. 150-grade fuel didn't just make engines faster, it made victory faster. Every gallon carried with it years of research, gallons of sweat, and thousands of lives depending on its success. Engineers at Rolls-Royce, chemists in American refineries, and brave test pilots risked everything to push the limits of combustion, pressure, and performance. And let's not forget what this transformation meant strategically. The Luftwaffe's once proud defense network began to crumble. The Mustangs hunted German fighters from Berlin to the Baltic. Fuel convoys, factories, and airfields once thought untouchable were now within Allied reach. The balance of the air war tipped, and it never swung back. Yet what makes this story extraordinary isn't just the science, it's the spirit behind it. It's the relentless determination to innovate, to adapt, and to overcome. It's proof that wars are not only fought with bullets and bravery, but with brains, chemistry, and courage in laboratories and workshops. Think about it. What is 150-grade fuel but a metaphor for human progress? It represents the moment when limitation met imagination and imagination won. It's a reminder that every great leap in history happens when someone dares to say, what if? What if we could fly faster? What if we could go further? What if we could do the impossible? And that's what the P-51 Mustang, fueled by 150-octane power, truly symbolizes: the triumph of ingenuity over fear. It wasn't just an airplane, it was a promise to every soldier and citizen that technology and teamwork could rewrite fate itself. When those silver Mustangs thundered over Germany, the sound wasn't merely the hum of engines. It was the roar of hope. It told the world that freedom had found its wings. By the war's end, the P-51 Mustang had become an icon, not just of air superiority, but of what humanity can achieve when necessity fuels innovation. The Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, never anticipated that a simple change in fuel chemistry could outpace their empire of machinery. Yet that's the beauty of history. It rewards creativity, not complacency. So the next time you hear that powerful phrase, Germans never expected 150-grade fuel to turn P-51s into 49mm demons, remember that it's not just a story of aviation, it's a story of transformation. A story of how science and courage working together can tilt the balance of the world. Because in every engine that roared and every pilot who flew, there was one burning truth: when you give human determination the right fuel, nothing is impossible. Thank you. When the Second World War erupted across Europe, the battlefield was not only fought on land and sea but stretched into a new and unforgiving dimension: the sky. The air became a realm where courage met engineering, where strategy met science, and where nations discovered that whoever commanded the skies could command the course of the war itself. By the early 1940s, it had become painfully clear to the Allied powers that Germany's Luftwaffe was a force unlike any other. Their pilots were well trained, their machines sleek and deadly, and their strategy precise. From the Blitz over London to the raids across Europe, the Luftwaffe's dominance was visible in every contrail streaking the clouds. For the Allies, it was a nightmare of attrition. Heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator were sent deep into enemy territory to cripple German factories, oil refineries, and rail networks. These missions were essential, but they were also deadly. German fighters, flying faster and higher, could tear through bomber formations before Allied aircraft even saw them coming. Escort fighters, the aircraft meant to protect bombers, simply could not fly far enough or fast enough. Their limited range forced them to turn back long before bombers reached the heart of Germany, leaving the lumbering aircraft exposed and vulnerable. The losses were catastrophic. Entire bomber groups vanished into the smoke and sky. Pilots were lost, crews captured, and morale began to waver. The situation demanded not just bravery but breakthrough innovation. The Allies needed something that could shift the balance. A fighter with the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany, the speed to outfly the Luftwaffe, and the agility to dominate in combat. It was not merely about aircraft. It was about survival, control, and ultimately victory. Amidst this desperation emerged the P-51 Mustang, designed by North American Aviation in response to a British request for a new fighter. What started as a hurried project would soon become one of the most iconic aircraft in history. Its frame was sleek, aerodynamic, and efficient, but its early models, powered by the Allison engine, struggled at high altitudes. The potential was there, sleeping beneath the metal skin, waiting for the right spark to awaken it. Engineers knew that the Mustang could be something extraordinary. It only needed the right heart to bring it to life. That heart came in the form of the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a British marvel of engineering that had already proven its worth in Spitfires and Hurricanes during the Battle of Britain. When the Merlin was fitted into the Mustang's frame, the transformation was astonishing. Suddenly, the aircraft climbed faster, flew higher, and handled with grace. It was faster than many German fighters, and could hold its own in dogfights that once spelled doom for Allied pilots. Yet even with this incredible fusion of design and power, the Mustang's true potential remained untapped. It was a sleeping giant, restrained not by its mechanics but by its fuel. You see, in the world of aviation, fuel is not just a liquid, it's the lifeblood of performance. The octane rating of fuel determines how much compression an engine can handle before detonating, and therefore how much power it can generate. The standard aviation fuel at the time, around 100 octane, worked well for most engines but limited how much boost pressure pilots could safely apply without risking engine failure. In combat, every extra ounce of power could mean the difference between victory and death. The Allies needed more. They needed fuel that could push engines beyond their limits without tearing them apart. Meanwhile, the Germans believed they had already reached the pinnacle of aviation chemistry. Their Bf-109s and Fu-190s ran on excellent high-grade fuel, and their engineers dismissed the idea that the Allies could create something more potent. Their intelligence reports underestimated the Allied capacity for industrial innovation, and that miscalculation would soon haunt them. Across laboratories in Britain and America, teams of chemists and engineers began experimenting with refining methods, additives, and blending techniques to push octane ratings higher. The process was complex and dangerous. A single miscalculation could destroy an engine or cause catastrophic explosions. But necessity breeds invention, and in the crucible of war, the impossible becomes merely a challenge to overcome. By 1944, the breakthrough came. The Allies had developed a new aviation fuel, 150-grade octane, far more resistant to pre-ignition and detonation. It allowed engines to run at higher boost pressures, delivering more horsepower without overheating or damage. For the P-51 Mustang's Merlin engine, this was like injecting lightning into its veins. With 150-grade fuel, the engine could be pushed harder and longer, generating a surge of speed and climb that stunned even its test pilots. What had been a fast aircraft suddenly became a demon of the sky, capable of reaching speeds close to 40-90 miles per hour, climbing faster than ever before, and maintaining power at altitudes where German fighters struggled to breathe. This transformation did not just enhance performance, it rewrote tactics. For the first time, Allied pilots could escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. They could engage the Luftwaffe on equal terms, or better. The air war that had once been a struggle for survival began to shift in the Allies' favor. German pilots, who once felt untouchable in their Messerschmitts, now found themselves being hunted by silver Mustangs that seemed to appear out of nowhere and vanish just as fast. The fuel alone, of course, was not the sole cause of victory, but it became the hidden weapon, the unseen edge that turned every Mustang into a predator. It gave Allied pilots not only speed but confidence. Imagine the psychological impact. For years, the Luftwaffe had owned the skies, dictating when and where battles occurred. Now every encounter carried uncertainty for them. The rules of engagement had changed, and yet, what is perhaps most remarkable about this moment in history is that it was born from the simplest of human qualities, the refusal to accept defeat. The development of 150-grade fuel required thousands of unseen heroes. The chemists who risked explosions in their laboratories, the refinery workers who blended volatile chemicals under pressure, the test pilots who flew experimental aircraft on the edge of destruction, and the strategists who believed that innovation could win wars. Each of them played a part in this silent revolution of power and speed. The sky, once dominated by the Luftwaffe's dark wings, began to shimmer with the silver flash of Mustangs. The tide of war was turning, not through sheer numbers, but through ingenuity and resilience. Allied bombers that had once fallen in waves now had protectors capable of going the distance. The air corridors to Germany were no longer death traps but highways to victory. This was the moment when the air war evolved from survival to supremacy. The Allies learned that control of the air was not a luxury. It was the foundation of every operation below. With every successful escort mission, with every German fighter shot down, the strategic balance shifted. Cities that had once been beyond reach now trembled under the thunder of Allied raids. The Luftwaffe, once invincible, began to crumble from exhaustion and loss. And all of it began because someone believed that better was possible. That even something as simple as fuel could change the course of history. The P-51 Mustang was the right machine, the Merlin was the right engine, but without 150-grade fuel, they were just parts of a potential waiting to be realized. Together, they became a legend, a testament to what human will and science can accomplish when they work in harmony. The first key to understanding this transformation lies in recognizing how desperate the Allies were for an advantage, and how the pursuit of that advantage led them to reimagine everything. From metallurgy to chemistry, from aerodynamics to logistics. The Germans had mastery, but the Allies had adaptability, and in war, it is adaptability that survives. The sky, once a domain of terror for bomber crews, became a stage for innovation courage. Every time a P-51 Mustang lifted off with tanks full of 150-grade fuel, it carried with it not just a pilot, but the combined effort of an entire industrial ecosystem. A collaboration between scientists, soldiers, and strategists, all striving toward one purpose. And when those engines roared to life, echoing across the airfields of England, they announced more than just the start of another mission. They declared that the balance of power in the air had changed forever. The first spark of that transformation, the understanding that the sky was the true battlefield, was what set the entire chain in motion. Without control of the air, armies could not advance, fleets could not sail safely, and cities could not be defended. The Allies' realization that air superiority was the key to survival drove them to pursue every technological edge, every possible improvement. It was not a single invention or a single battle that turned the tide, but the unrelenting pursuit of better solutions. The story of 150-grade fuel and the P-51 Mustang begins, therefore, not in a factory or a lab, but in the determination of a people who refuse to surrender the skies. It is the story of how innovation becomes weaponized, how knowledge becomes defense, and how in the crucible of war, the very elements of air and fire are bent to serve human will. The Allies' victory in the air began long before their Mustangs screamed across German skies. It began the moment they understood that the sky itself was the true battleground, and that mastery of it would decide the fate of the world. When the first P-51 Mustang rolled out of the North American Aviation factory in 1940, few could have imagined that this aircraft would one day become the symbol of Allied air dominance. Born from urgency and necessity, the Mustang's story is one of innovation under pressure, of how a design that began as a response to Britain's desperate plea for more fighters evolved into a weapon that changed the very balance of the air war. In its early form, however, the P-51 was a machine of unfulfilled promise. It was good, remarkably good, but it wasn't yet the legend it would become. When Britain first approached North American aviation, they didn't come seeking an entirely new aircraft. The Royal Air Force had wanted more Curtiss P-40 Warhawks, a fighter that was sturdy and reliable, but rapidly becoming outdated. North Americans' engineers, led by James Dutch, Kindleberger and Edgar Schiemuth, boldly proposed something better, an entirely new fighter that could outperform the P-40 and still be built in record time. The British agreed, and the result was the prototype designated the NA-73X, a machine that embodied American-designed brilliance and British wartime need. From the moment the prototype took to the air in October 1940, it was clear that something special had been created. The P-51 Mustang featured a revolutionary laminar flow wing, a design that minimized drag and allowed it to cut through the air with exceptional efficiency. Its sleek fuselage and low-drag radiator scoop gave it a streamlined profile that promised speed and agility. On paper, it was everything a modern fighter should be: fast, elegant, and ahead of its time. But war is rarely kind to paper promises. The early P-51s were equipped with the Allison V1710 engine, a sturdy American power plant that performed well at low and medium altitudes but struggled above 15,000 feet. Unfortunately, that was the realm where the Luftwaffe ruled supreme. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and Foch Wolf 190 were designed for high-altitude performance, where they intercepted Allied bombers and engaged enemy fighters. When the Mustang climbed to those altitudes, its Allison engine began to gasp for air, losing power, speed, and maneuverability. It could still outturn and outdive many opponents at lower levels, but in the upper sky where the real battles were being fought, it was outmatched. For a time, the Mustang served primarily as a reconnaissance and ground attack aircraft. Its range, stability, and rugged design made it perfect for low-level missions, strafing convoys, and attacking enemy infrastructure. Pilots appreciated its handling and reliability, but it was clear that the Mustang had the soul of a racehorse trapped in the body of a workhorse. It could do more, it was meant to do more, but something was holding it back. That something was the engine. And in war, every limitation is a challenge waiting for the right mind to overcome it. The British, always keen observers of performance, suspected that the Mustang's airframe had far greater potential than its Allison engine allowed. Across the Atlantic, engineers at Rolls-Royce were working wonders with their Merlin engine, the same power plant that had given the Supermarine Spitfire its wings of victory in the Battle of Britain. The Merlin's two-stage supercharger allowed it to maintain high power output even at great altitudes, a critical advantage in dogfighting and bomber escort missions. Someone somewhere must have looked at the Mustang and thought, what if we put a Merlin in it? It was a simple question, but one that would change the course of aviation history. In late 1942, British engineers at Rolls-Royce and the American Packard Motor Company, which was producing Merlin engines under license, began experimenting. They replaced the Allison engine with a Packard-built Merlin and adjusted the airframe to accommodate the new power plant's cooling and airflow requirements. The results were immediate and astonishing. The transformed aircraft, designated the P-51B and later the P-51C, was no longer just a promising design, it was a revelation. The new Mustang could now reach speeds of over 40 miles per hour, climb rapidly to high altitudes, and maneuver with a grace that left pilots speechless. Its range, already impressive, now stretched even further. With drop tanks, it could fly over 1,600 miles, escorting bombers deep into German territory and back again, something no other Allied fighter could do. Test pilots returned from their first flights awestruck. They had flown many aircraft before, Spitfires, Thunderbolts, Lightnings, but nothing felt like this. The Mustang wasn't just fast, it was balanced. It responded like an extension of the pilot's own body, turning, climbing, and diving with unmatched harmony. Its laminar flow wings sliced through the air with minimal resistance, and its control surfaces allowed precise handling even at extreme speeds. Pilots described it as fighter that flew like a dream but fought like a demon. In the European theater, where every mission was a test of endurance and courage, this new P-51 was the answer to the Allies' prayers. Until its arrival, bomber crews flying missions into Germany had to endure terrifying odds. The Luftwaffe's fighters would wait for the Allied escorts to turn back, limited by fuel and range, and then swoop in to devastate the bomber formations. Losses were staggering. But when the Mustangs arrived, they didn't turn back, they stayed. They flew side by side with the bombers all the way to the target, engaged German fighters head-on, and still had fuel to fight their way home. For the first time, the bombers had true guardians of the sky. The Germans were unprepared for this shift. Their intelligence reports knew of the Mustang but dismissed it as just another Allied fighter. They did not realize that this new P-51 was powered by a Merlin heart, and that this combination had transformed it into something entirely different. A machine capable of matching or exceeding the speed and performance of their best aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of the skies, began to lose control. German pilots found themselves facing an enemy that could climb higher, dive faster, and stay in the fight longer. The Mustang's presence altered not only tactics but morale. For Allied bomber crews, the sight of the silver, winged P-51s weaving through their formations was a sight of salvation. They called them little friends. For the German pilots, those same glints of silver meant something else entirely, the beginning of the end of their air superiority. Even the psychological balance of the air war began to shift. Confidence was contagious, and the Allies now had it in abundance. Behind this success lay an extraordinary collaboration. The Mustang's design was American, its engine British, and its fuel soon to be an Allied innovation that would unlock even more power. It represented the very spirit of unity that defined the Allied war effort. Different nations, different minds working together for a single purpose. This synthesis of design and engineering was not the result of chance but of shared determination. The British had believed in the Mustang's potential even when its early versions faltered. The Americans had the industrial might to produce it in staggering numbers. Together, they forged the ultimate long-range fighter. When the P-51D model entered service in 1944, it brought even more improvements. Better visibility through a bubble canopy, increased firepower with 6.50 caliber machine guns, and refinements that made it one of the most complete fighters of the war. It became the backbone of the US 8th Air Force, escorting bombers on raids over Berlin, Leipzig and Hamburg. It hunted German fighters relentlessly, sweeping the skies clean ahead of Allied ground advances. But beyond statistics and engineering, there was something almost poetic about the P-51 Mustang's evolution. It began as an aircraft built to meet a contract, a hurried response to an urgent demand. Yet through the vision of engineers and the courage of pilots, it became a masterpiece of aviation art. It was as if destiny had sculpted it piece by piece, the wings, the fuselage, the engine, until everything aligned perfectly. The sleeping giant had awakened, and when it did, it roared. For the men who flew it, the Mustang was more than a machine. It was a companion, a protector, and sometimes a miracle. Pilots spoke of its reliability, its forgiving nature, and its strength. It could take hits and keep flying, it could dive out of danger, and it could fight its way through anything. There was a bond between pilot and plane, a sense of trust that few aircraft ever inspired. Many who flew Mustangs later said that it felt alive, as if it understood what was being asked of it and gave everything in return. The Mustang story is also the story of innovation rising from necessity. War compresses time, forcing invention at a pace that peace rarely demands. Engineers who might have taken years to test and refine ideas instead had to make breakthroughs in months. The Mustang is the embodiment of that wartime urgency, an aircraft that went from drawing board to legend in record time because the world simply could not wait. And when that sleeping giant finally stretched its wings, it did more than just fight, it defined a new era of air combat. The combination of its aerodynamic efficiency, long-range, high-speed, and high-altitude performance set the standard for post-war fighter design. Long after the guns fell silent, the Mustang would go on to serve in other conflicts, breaking speed records and reminding generations of aviators what true engineering excellence looked like. But in those crucial years of 1943 and 1944, when the fate of Europe hung in the balance, the awakening of the Mustang changed everything. It was proof that brilliance often begins with imperfection, that even a machine that starts with flaws can evolve into something extraordinary when imagination, collaboration, and persistence come together. The P-51 Mustang was no longer just a fighter, it was freedom with wings. The world of aviation, especially during the crucible of the Second World War, was not simply a contest of machines but a relentless battle of chemistry, physics, and human ingenuity. When the Allies discovered the power of 150-grade high-octane aviation fuel, they did not merely improve performance, they transformed their aircraft into something extraordinary. It was an invisible weapon, a force of innovation that the Germans never anticipated, one that would supercharge engines, rewrite tactics, and change the tempo of the air war forever. In many ways, this fuel was as decisive as any new aircraft design or weapon system. It was the hidden spark that turned the P-51 Mustang from an exceptional fighter into a near supernatural force that dominated the skies at almost 500 miles per hour. To understand the significance of 150-grade fuel, one must understand what octane means in the first place. Every internal combustion engine, whether in a car or an aircraft, works by compressing fuel and air in its cylinders and igniting the mixture to create power. The more the mixture can be compressed before ignition, the more energy the engine can release. But there is a limit. Push it too far and the fuel explodes prematurely, causing knocking, which can destroy an engine. High-octane fuel resists this premature detonation, allowing for higher compression, greater boost pressures, and consequently far more power. The higher the octane, the harder the engine can work without tearing itself apart. Before 1944, but generally powered by 100-octane fuel, already an advancement over the 87-octane used earlier in the war. It was a good fuel, stable, efficient, and safe. But as air combat intensified, it became clear that good was no longer enough. Pilots needed every ounce of speed, climb rate, and power that could be extracted from their engines. The Luftwaffe's fighters, especially the Focke-Wulf Tu-190 and the later models of the Messerschmitt Bf 109, were fierce opponents with engines fine-tuned for performance. They could dive, climb, and maneuver aggressively, often giving German pilots an edge in battle. To match and surpass them, Allied engineers had to think beyond design and mechanics. They had to look inside the very lifeblood of flight, the fuel itself. Across Britain and the United States, scientists and chemists began experimenting with refining methods to create a fuel that could sustain higher power output without causing detonation. They blended base stocks with special additives, tetraethyl-lead aromatic hydrocarbons and other compounds, to improve stability and resistance to pre-ignition. It was dangerous, complex work. Laboratories became miniature battlefields of science, where experiments could end in explosions if the balance of chemicals went wrong. But from that danger came breakthrough after breakthrough. The result was 150 grade aviation fuel, a substance that seemed almost magical in what it allowed engines to do. When this fuel was introduced to the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines powering the P-51 Mustangs, the transformation was immediate and dramatic. The Merlin was already a superb engine famous for its reliability and smooth performance, but it had been limited by the fuels available to it. Once fed with 150 octane, the Merlin could be pushed to a new level: higher manifold pressures, greater power at altitude, and astonishing acceleration. Test results stunned even the engineers who had created it. Aircraft running on the new fuel achieved top speeds approaching 490 miles per hour, an extraordinary number for piston-driven fighters of the time. Climb rates improved sharply, allowing Mustangs to reach combat altitude faster than ever before. In dogfights, every second mattered. The ability to climb or accelerate even slightly faster could determine who lived and who died. With 150 grade fuel, those seconds belonged to the Allies. The Germans had no answer. Their own fuel, though high quality, was limited to around 96 to 100 octane, constrained by refining capacity and access to key additives. They had experimented with synthetic fuels derived from coal, but these were never as efficient or powerful as what the Allies were now producing in vast quantities. The Luftwaffe's engineers simply did not believe the Allies could safely run engines at the kind of boost pressures 150 grade fuel allowed. They assumed that doing so would cause catastrophic failures. To their shock, the opposite was true. Allied engines, properly tuned and maintained, handled the stress beautifully, producing sustained power levels that defied German expectations. The first combat trials of aircraft using the new fuel began in 1944. Pilots returning from missions reported incredible results. They could dive away from German fighters with ease, climb through the clouds at rates that left enemies behind, and chase down targets that previously would have escaped. A P-51 on 150 grade fuel could keep pace with or surpass anything the Luftwaffe fielded. Even the feared foe 190, with its powerful BMW radial engine, struggled to compete at higher altitudes where the Mustang thrived. The difference wasn't only in speed, it was in control. The high-octane fuel allowed the Merlin engine to maintain consistent power output even under extreme stress. In combat where pilots throttled up and down, performed tight turns and dove at high speeds, the stability of power delivery was vital. The Mustang didn't just go fast, it went fast smoothly, without the surging or engine knock that could plague lesser fuels. Pilots could rely on their machines completely, focusing on the fight rather than worrying about mechanical limits. The tactical implications were enormous. Before the introduction of 150 grade fuel, Allied fighters struggled to maintain air cover for long-range bombing missions. The Luftwaffe could wait until escort fighters turned back and then ambush the bombers. But with the enhanced performance and range of P-51s using high-octane fuel, those days were over. The Mustangs could accompany bombers deep into German territory and back again, engaging interceptors all the way. It was as if an invisible shield had been placed over the bomber formations. German pilots began to realize, with growing dread, that there was no longer any safe altitude, no sanctuary in the sky. There was also a psychological shift. Power has a sound, a deep, confident growl that can be heard before it's seen. The 150-octane fueled Merlin had that sound. German pilots spoke of the distinct menacing hum of Mustangs as they approached, a sound that seemed to announce inevitability. In dogfights, Allied pilots now felt an exhilarating confidence. They knew their aircraft could push harder, climb longer, and fight faster. That morale boost was almost as valuable as the technical one. Behind the scenes, however, the story of 150 grade fuel was also one of immense industrial effort. Producing such a high-performance fuel required advanced refining techniques and massive logistical coordination. The United States, with its vast oil resources and industrial capacity, became the powerhouse behind its production. Refineries in places like Baton Rouge, Baytown, and Philadelphia worked around the clock to meet demand. Tankers carried the precious liquid across the Atlantic, where it was distributed to Allied airfields under tight security. Every gallon was a product of chemistry, courage, and coordination. There were challenges too. Engines had to be carefully tuned to handle the increased boost pressures. Maintenance crews were trained to monitor temperatures, pressures, and mixture ratios to ensure reliability. But once those systems were perfected, the results spoke for themselves. The Mustang became quite literally a different aircraft. It could chase down enemy fighters at will, escort bombers at high altitude, and, when necessary, dive into the fray with unstoppable force. For the Germans, the sudden leap in Allied performance was bewildering. Intelligence officers tried to make sense of reports from the front. How were the Americans achieving such speeds? How could their aircraft climb so fast or maintain such consistent power at altitude? They suspected some new engine design or supercharger modification, but the truth was simpler and more devastating. It was the fuel, a chemical change that, to the naked eye, looked no different from any other gasoline, had quietly rewritten the laws of aerial warfare. The irony was that German chemists were among the best in the world. Before the war, they had pioneered synthetic fuels and advanced lubricants. But by 1944, Allied bombing campaigns had crippled their refineries, disrupted supply chains, and made large-scale production of high-quality fuel nearly impossible. Meanwhile, the Allies, with their protected industrial base, continued to refine, experiment, and innovate. The result was not only superiority in numbers but in performance, an edge that no amount of pilot skill could overcome. Every major technological revolution in warfare carries with it a moment of disbelief, a point when one side realizes that the other has achieved something they thought impossible. For the Luftwaffe, that moment came when they first encountered the 150-octane fueled Mustangs. The speed readings didn't make sense. Their pilots reported being overtaken in dives, chased at altitudes where Allied fighters were once sluggish, and out-climbed even by heavily armed escorts. Their commanders dismissed these claims at first, attributing them to pilot error or exaggeration. But as the encounters multiplied, denial gave way to grim acceptance. The enemy's machines had surpassed theirs, and all of it traced back to fuel. Not a new weapon, not a new airframe, but the invisible chemistry of progress. The Allies had unlocked more than octane. They had unlocked potential. They had demonstrated that in war, as in peace, the key to victory often lies in unseen details, in the willingness to question limits and test boundaries. The 150-grade fuel wasn't just a technical achievement. It was a symbol of how deeply intertwined science and warfare had become. It represented the merging of the laboratory and the battlefield, where equations written in chalk on a board translated into speed and survival thousands of feet above the earth. For the men who flew with it, this invisible innovation was life itself, the difference between being hunted and being free. In the skies over Europe, the P-51 Mustang, once a capable fighter, became something almost supernatural. It could dive through cloud and sunlight alike, chase its prey across the horizon, and return home unscathed. Pilots described the feeling as intoxicating. The raw surge of power, the effortless climb, the way the machine seemed to leap forward when the throttle was opened. It was as if the aircraft itself knew what it had become, a demon of speed, a creation of fire, metal, and chemistry. And for the Germans, who had once ruled the sky with confidence, the sound of those engines was a warning. A reminder that innovation never sleeps, and that sometimes, the greatest weapon of all is the one you can't see. When the skies over Europe began to hum with the deep, steady roar of Allied engines that never seemed to tire, the German Luftwaffe knew something had changed. But they did not yet understand what. For years, the air war had been their domain, their stage of dominance. From the Polish campaign in 1939 to the early triumphs of the Blitz, the Luftwaffe had built an almost mythic reputation as an unstoppable force. Their tactics were precise, their aircraft deadly, and their pilots some of the best trained warriors in the world. But by late 1943 and into 1944, cracks began to appear, first small, then widening, until the entire structure of their air superiority began to crumble. What the Germans did not know was that beneath this collapse lay an invisible enemy: chemistry, innovation, and fuel. The introduction of 150-octane fuel to Allied aircraft, and the transformation it created in planes like the P-51 Mustang, sent shockwaves through the Luftwaffe that went far beyond the battlefield. It shattered their confidence, unbalanced their strategy, and exposed the limits of even their most advanced engineering. At first, reports from the front seemed unbelievable. German pilots returning from missions over France and the Low Countries spoke of American fighters that climbed with unnatural speed, that dove faster than anything they had ever seen, and that could maintain pursuit well into the high altitudes where Luftwaffe planes were supposed to reign supreme. Intelligence officers dismissed the accounts as exaggeration or combat fatigue. After all, the performance of Allied aircraft had been consistent for years. The British Spitfires, the American Thunderbolts and Mustangs, they were formidable, yes, but familiar. The Luftwaffe had studied them in detail, captured some, even flown them in tests. There was nothing the Allies could do to make those machines defy physics. But the battlefield was changing, and the Germans were watching a miracle unfold in the skies, one they did not understand and could not counter. In air combat, power translates to life. The ability to climb faster means the difference between being the hunter and the hunted. The ability to accelerate in a dive means the ability to escape or to strike with lethal precision. For years, the Luftwaffe's fighters, especially the Foch, Wolf 190 and the Messerschmitt Bf 109G, had enjoyed an advantage in these critical aspects. Their engines, fine-tuned and engineered to the limits of technology, delivered bursts of power that made them supreme in the right hands. But as the Allies began feeding 150-grade fuel into the Rolls-Royce Merlin and Packard-built engines of the P-51 Mustangs and Spitfires, everything shifted. German pilots suddenly found themselves out-climbed, out-dived, and most painfully outrun. They could not believe what they were seeing. Their aircraft, once symbols of supremacy, were now struggling to keep up with their enemies. The shock was not only physical, it was psychological. Luftwaffe pilots, trained to fight aggressively and with absolute confidence, began to lose faith in their machines. There was an old saying among pilots, "Trust your aircraft and it will bring you home." But now, even the most experienced aces felt betrayed by their engines. In engagements over Normandy, over the Ardennes, and later over Germany itself, they would pour every ounce of throttle into their machines, only to watch the Allied fighters close in effortlessly. It wasn't just a loss of performance, it was a loss of pride. For men who had once believed they flew the finest aircraft in the world, realizing that the Allies had surpassed them was a bitter humiliation. At German airfields, confusion reigned. Engineers and mechanics tore apart captured Allied aircraft, examining every bolt and piston for clues. What they found puzzled them. The engines were familiar designs, not dramatically different from those they already knew. The airframes were elegant but not revolutionary. There was no hidden supercharger, no secret modification, nothing that explained the leap in performance. What they could not see, what no inspection could reveal, was the invisible difference inside the fuel tanks. The 150 grade fuel the Allies now used had properties beyond anything the Germans could produce. It allowed the Merlin engine to run at unprecedented boost pressures, generating massive power without the detonation that would destroy lesser fuels. It was the quiet genius of chemistry that had outpaced even Germany's engineering prowess. By the time the Luftwaffe began to grasp the truth, the damage was irreversible. Their own fuel supply was deteriorating rapidly. Allied bombing campaigns had systematically targeted refineries, synthetic fuel plants, and transportation lines. Germany's dependence on synthetic fuel, produced from coal through the Fischer-Tropsch process, became its Achilles heel. The synthetic fuel was serviceable but inferior, with lower octane ratings and poor performance at high altitudes. Engineers tried to compensate by increasing supercharger pressures and adjusting mixture ratios, but these were desperate measures that strained engines and reduced lifespan. While the Allies' Mustangs soared at 490 miles per hour, the Luftwaffe's fighters often struggled with unreliable engines and dwindling supplies. The introduction of 150-octane fuel to the Allies' range escort fighters, particularly the P-51 Mustang, was catastrophic for the Luftwaffe's strategic position. Before its arrival, Germany's one remaining advantage lay in its defense, in-depth strategy. They could wait for Allied bombers to reach their operational limits, knowing that the fighters escorting them would have to turn back due to limited range. Once the escorts left, the Luftwaffe could descend upon the bomber streams with near impunity. It was a brutal but effective tactic. The arrival of the Mustang, with its massive range and high speed endurance, already threatened this strategy. But once the Mustang was upgraded with 150-grade fuel, the threat turned into annihilation. Now the P-51s could not only escort bombers deep into the heart of Germany but also engage in extended dogfights on equal, or superior, terms with the Luftwaffe's finest fighters. The first missions that used the new fuel left a deep mark. Luftwaffe commanders were stunned by the losses. Entire squadrons of interceptors were cut down before they could even reach bomber formations. Pilots who once dived confidently into battle now hesitated, aware that the enemy was faster, could climb higher, and could stay in the fight longer. There was no tactical adjustment that could fully compensate for that. Desperation led to the introduction of emergency power systems like MW50, methanol water injection that temporarily increased boost pressure, but this was only a stopgap. It provided a short burst of extra power at the cost of engine reliability and fuel consumption. Against the sustained performance of Mustangs on 150-grade fuel, these measures were little more than bandages on a mortal wound. The psychological toll was immense. The Luftwaffe had been built on a foundation of aggressive doctrine. Attack first, press the advantage, overwhelm the enemy with speed and precision. But when the tables turned, that doctrine became a liability. Pilots could no longer rely on superior acceleration to disengage, nor could they climb out of danger. The hunter had become the hunted, and every encounter carried the risk of annihilation. For the younger pilots, often sent into battle with minimal training due to Germany's mounting losses, morale plummeted. They entered the skies knowing that their chances of survival were slim, facing enemies who seemed to have limitless power and endurance. For veterans, the frustration was palpable. They could see the skill of their comrades wasted against machines that simply outperformed their own in every measurable way. Within the Luftwaffe's command structure, panic turned into paralysis. Strategic discussions became circular. Some insisted the Allies had developed an entirely new type of engine. Others proposed that the Americans were secretly using jet-assisted fighters. It seemed impossible that such an advantage could come merely from fuel. But when samples of Allied gasoline were finally analyzed, the truth became undeniable. The octane rating was higher than anything Germany could achieve under wartime conditions. Their chemical industry, once a global leader, was now strangled by shortages of vital additives like tetrathiol lead and isooctane. Even when attempts were made to produce high-octane blends, the lack of refining capacity and raw materials rendered them inconsistent and unreliable. Meanwhile, the effects of this imbalance rippled through every level of the Luftwaffe's operations. Airfields came under increasing attack as the Allies gained air supremacy. Supply lines were bombed with impunity. Aircraft production continued, but without skilled pilots and reliable fuel, new fighters were little more than targets waiting to be destroyed. The introduction of the jet-powered Mi-262 offered a brief glimmer of hope, but even that revolutionary aircraft could not operate in sufficient numbers to change the tide. And when the Mi-262s took off, they often faced swarms of Mustangs already waiting above them. Powered by the same invisible advantage that had crippled the Luftwaffe months earlier, the shock extended beyond the airfields. On the ground, ordinary German citizens began to notice the change in the skies. Where once the Luftwaffe had been a source of national pride, now the sound of Allied bombers and their escorts filled the air day and night. Civilians watched helplessly as their cities burned, wondering why their own fighters seemed unable to stop the destruction. The myth of Luftwaffe invincibility, carefully crafted by years of propaganda, disintegrated under the reality of Allied air dominance. For the first time, the German people could see that their air force was no longer a shield, but a remnant of past glory. Inside the command rooms of Berlin, the truth was bitter. The Luftwaffe's leaders, men who had once orchestrated the Blitz over London, were now powerless to defend their own capital. Reports poured in daily, losses mounting, fuel reserves dwindling, morale collapsing. Every attempt to counter the Allied advance was met with overwhelming firepower from the sky. The Allies had achieved what the Luftwaffe once believed impossible: total control of the air. And all of it, to a large extent, stemmed from a change so small and so technical that it defied imagination. A few extra molecules of resistance to detonation, a few degrees more compression, a few pounds more of boost, had tilted the balance of the war. To the German engineers and pilots who survived the war, the realization was both humbling and haunting. The Luftwaffe had been defeated not only by numbers or strategy but by innovation, by an unseen evolution in science that their enemy had quietly mastered. In interviews and memoirs after the war, many Luftwaffe veterans spoke with awe about the sudden transformation of Allied aircraft. They remembered the moment they first encountered a Mustang that seemed to climb forever, or a Spitfire that accelerated beyond anything physics should have allowed. It was, in their eyes, as if the Allies had discovered a secret source of power, a gift from the gods of flight. They did not yet know it was chemistry. In the end, the shock to the Luftwaffe was not just the loss of superiority, but the realization of how fragile dominance can be. The empire of the air they had once ruled so confidently had been undone by an invisible force. It was not bombs or bullets that broke their pride first. It was the quiet hiss of fuel flowing through an Allied engine, the unseen transformation of science into speed, and the echoing roar of an aircraft that could no longer be caught. As the Second World War reached its crescendo, the fate of nations was being decided not only by soldiers on the ground or generals in war rooms, but by the invisible alchemy of fuel coursing through engines thousands of feet above the earth. The Allies' adoption of 150-octane fuel was not a mere technical adjustment. It was a turning point, a decisive transformation that rippled through every theater of the air war. This innovation, hidden within the roar of engines and the shimmer of contrails, helped shift the balance of power irreversibly. When historians speak of D-Day, of strategic bombing campaigns, and of Allied dominance in 1944 and 1945, they often credit courage, strategy, and numbers. But behind all of that lay a potent secret, a few molecules that made the difference between life and death, victory and defeat. The 150-octane fuel, born of chemistry and necessity, became one of the silent architects of Allied triumph. In warfare, small advantages accumulate until they form an unbreakable edge. By early 1944, the Allies were preparing for their greatest challenge, the invasion of occupied Europe. Success required absolute control of the skies. Every bomber, every transport, every paratrooper dropping into Normandy depended on the ability of Allied fighters to dominate the air above them. For months, Allied scientists, engineers, and tacticians had been working to ensure that when the time came, no German aircraft would be able to threaten the invasion. The P-51 Mustang, the Spitfire Mackay-X, and the P-47 Thunderbolt were already formidable machines, but they needed just a little more speed, more climb rate, more endurance, to make total air supremacy possible. That little more came in a canister marked with 3 digits, 150. To understand the magnitude of what 150-octane fuel accomplished, one must first appreciate what it allowed engines to do. The octane rating of fuel measures its resistance to detonation under compression. Higher octane fuels allow for greater boost pressures in supercharged engines, meaning the pilot can force more air and fuel into the cylinders without causing premature ignition, an event that would otherwise destroy the engine. Before the introduction of 150-grade fuel, Allied aircraft used 100-130 fuel, which allowed for moderate boost levels. With 150-octane, pilots could safely increase manifold pressure by several pounds per square inch, unlocking enormous bursts of power. For the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66 engine used in late-model Spitfires and Mustangs, this meant an increase of over 300 horsepower, enough to transform an already excellent aircraft into something transcendent. The results were immediate and astonishing. Tests conducted by the Royal Air Force showed that Spitfires using 150-octane fuel gained as much as 25 miles per hour at sea level and over 15 miles per hour at higher altitudes. More importantly, their rate of climb improved dramatically. In combat, this meant that a pilot could reach advantageous positions faster, dive away from danger, or pursue fleeing enemies with newfound aggression. The P-51 Mustang, when fed with the same high-octane fuel, became a predator without equal, its top speed rising to nearly 490 miles per hour, its acceleration so fierce that even veteran Luftwaffe pilots found themselves unable to break contact. The combination of this speed and the Mustang's immense range turned the air war into a one-sided contest. As 1944 unfolded, the strategic consequences became clear. The Allies no longer merely contested the skies, they owned them. The bomber streams that once suffered catastrophic losses over Germany now flew with powerful escorts that could not only defend but also hunt. The Luftwaffe, battered and demoralized, began to lose its grip entirely. German fighter bases were attacked relentlessly, their planes caught on the ground or intercepted moments after takeoff. The sheer energy unleashed by the 150-octane fueled engines allowed Allied fighters to dive on targets at incredible speeds, make multiple passes, and climb back into formation before the enemy could react. Each of these tactical advantages stemmed from a chemical leap invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable in its impact. When the Allied invasion of Normandy began on June 6, 1944, The importance of air supremacy was demonstrated on an unprecedented scale. In the days leading up to D-Day, Allied aircraft flew thousands of sorties, striking railways, convoys, radar installations, and coastal defenses. On the morning of the invasion, more than 11,000 aircraft filled the skies above northern France. German reinforcements attempting to move toward the beaches were annihilated from the air. Columns of tanks and trucks were reduced to wreckage before they could reach the front lines. The Luftwaffe's attempts to intervene were pitiful in comparison. Only a few scattered squadrons managed to take off, and those that did were swiftly intercepted by Mustangs and Thunderbolts running on 150-octane fuel. The few German aircraft that managed to penetrate the Allied air umbrella were hunted down ruthlessly. Not a single major Allied ship or landing zone suffered serious air attack that day. It was complete dominance, and high-performance fuel was one of the unseen engines behind it. The influence of 150-octane fuel extended beyond the skies over France. It reshaped the strategic bombing campaign over Germany itself. Before its introduction, long-range bombing missions were perilous ventures. B-17s and B-24s would fly deep into enemy territory, often without fighter escort for the final stages of the mission. Casualty rates among bomber crews were staggering, with some squadrons losing half their men within a few weeks. But once the Mustangs with their 150 fueled engines entered the fray, the situation reversed dramatically. Now, bombers were accompanied from takeoff to target and back. The Luftwaffe's once effective bomber-destroyer formations equipped with heavy cannons designed to shred Allied bombers became easy prey. The Allies could strike targets deep inside Germany, factories, oil refineries, transportation hubs, without suffering the crippling losses that had once plagued them. Every successful bombing run further degraded the German war machine, creating a downward spiral from which the rage could not recover. Fuel, in the end, became both weapon and weakness. As the Allies refined and distributed their superior fuel blends, Germany's own supplies dwindled. The destruction of Ploty, the loss of Romanian oil fields, and the bombing of synthetic fuel plants left the Luftwaffe desperate. Their remaining aviation fuel was often of such low quality that engines performed poorly and required frequent maintenance. The contrast could not have been starker. While Allied pilots pushed their engines to new limits, German pilots struggled to coax power from theirs. Allied intelligence reports even noted that captured German aircraft, when refueled with Allied 150-octane fuel, demonstrated significantly improved performance. A painful reminder of how critical this invisible resource had become. The power of the new fuel also forced changes in tactics and strategy that accelerated Allied success. Pilots began to fly higher and faster, engaging in vertical combat maneuvers that would have been impossible before. The ability to climb rapidly meant that Allied aircraft could dictate the terms of battle, striking from above and disengaging at will. In bomber escort missions, Mustangs used their speed advantage to patrol ahead and around the formations, ambushing German interceptors before they could organize. The same fuel also allowed ground attack fighters to operate with greater agility, strafing enemy columns and withdrawing before anti-aircraft fire could find its mark. The synergy between speed, altitude, and range turned the Allies' air forces into a precision instrument capable of shaping the battlefield below. But beyond the technical advantages, 150-octane fuel carried a deeper, almost symbolic meaning. It represented the triumph of Allied cooperation, the fusion of British scientific research, American industrial power, and shared determination. The fuel's development was itself a marvel of wartime ingenuity. Chemists in Britain and the United States experimented tirelessly with additives such as isooctane, tetraethyl lead, and aromatic hydrocarbons to produce a blend that could withstand the immense pressures of combat engines. Refineries were retooled, supply chains expanded, and testing facilities operated around the clock. The logistical challenge of producing and distributing this advanced fuel to every Allied airbase across Europe and the Pacific was monumental, yet it was accomplished with astonishing efficiency. Every gallon shipped was a small act of strategy, every drop a step closer to victory. In the final year of the war, as Allied forces pushed into Germany, the skies were no longer contested, they were owned. The Luftwaffe, reduced to scattered pockets of resistance, could no longer defend its cities or armies. Even the introduction of revolutionary weapons like the Me-262 jet fighter could not reverse the tide. The jets were fast, yes, but they required massive amounts of specialized fuel, and their bases were under constant attack. Allied fighters running on their potent 150-octane lifeblood prowled the skies like watchful predators. Supply trains, bridges, and troop movements were obliterated before they could reinforce the front. German troops began to call the daylight hours terror from the sky, knowing that Allied aircraft were always overhead. On the ground, the consequences were immense. The success of the Normandy invasion, the rapid Allied advance through France, and the final offensives into Germany were all made possible by air superiority. Armies could move freely, supply lines could remain open, and enemy forces could be isolated and destroyed. Every tank that advanced, every soldier that marched, did so under the protective shadow of aircraft powered by that extraordinary fuel. It was not glamorous, and few outside the military understood its importance, but without it, the tempo of Allied operations would have slowed, and the cost of victory would have risen dramatically. Even in the Pacific theater, the lessons learned in Europe carried over. The high-octane fuels developed for Mustangs and Spitfires found their way into the engines of long-range bombers and naval aircraft, allowing them to operate farther, faster, and with greater reliability across vast oceanic distances. The technological leap that began as a solution for European air combat became a global standard for modern aviation, setting the stage for post-war advances in engine design, fuel chemistry, and flight performance. The legacy of 150-octane fuel lived on, not just in the stories of dogfights and daring pilots, but in the very DNA of aviation progress. For the men who fought the air war, the change was felt intimately. Pilots who had once struggled to gain altitude or chase an opponent now felt invincible. Mechanics, who once worried about engines overheating or detonating under stress, now marveled at their resilience. Commanders could plan missions with newfound confidence, knowing that their aircraft would not merely survive but dominate. The morale boost was immeasurable. It was as though the Allies had discovered an extra gear, a secret strength that the enemy could neither match nor understand. And in war, confidence is as powerful as firepower. The 150-octane fuel then was more than a scientific achievement. It was the silent hand guiding the Allies toward victory, the unseen force behind the roaring engines that darkened the skies over Europe and carried the hope of liberation on their wings. It was chemistry turned into destiny, innovation turned into triumph, and proof that sometimes the smallest changes, the subtlest refinements, can alter the course of history itself. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and lovers of history, there are few stories from the Second World War that combine the grandeur of human engineering, the pride of nations, and the devastating lesson of hubris quite like the story of Yamato, the mighty battleship of the Imperial Japanese Navy. When Japan launched Yamato in 1941, she was the embodiment of naval supremacy. Towering over the seas, armored like a floating fortress and armed with 9 colossal 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, Yamato represented Japan's unshakable belief that no enemy could challenge her power. The admirals who oversaw her construction believed they had built something beyond destruction, a vessel that could single-handedly change the tide of war. They called her unsinkable. But history, as it so often does, had a different verdict. By April 1945, the war in the Pacific had turned against Japan. The United States had seized the Marianas, captured Iwo Jima, and was closing in on Okinawa. The Japanese Navy, once proud and mighty, was now a shadow of its former self, low on fuel, aircraft, and hope. Yet, in one final act of defiance, Japan decided to send Yamato on a mission that could only end in death. Operation 10 Go, it was called. The plan was suicidal from the start. Yamato, along with a handful of escort ships, would sail south to Okinawa and attack the American fleet supporting the invasion. The ship had only enough fuel for a one-way trip. The crew knew that they would not be coming back. But the Admiralty believed that if Yamato could beach herself and serve as a stationary fortress, she might at least inflict symbolic damage, an echo of Japan's warrior spirit. Even in defeat, when Yamato left port on April 6, 1945, more than 3,000 sailors stood on her decks. They were young, loyal, and filled with a grim resolve. Some carried personal letters folded in their uniforms. Others whispered quiet prayers to the sea. Above them towered their ship, the pride of Japan, the largest battleship ever to sail. But waiting for her was not another battleship. Waiting for her was the future. On the morning of April 7th, American reconnaissance aircraft spotted Yamato. And then the storm came, not of wind and rain, but of steel and fire. Over 300 US planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters launched wave after wave of attacks from the sky. The ocean churned with explosions as bombs and torpedoes tore into the great ship's armor. The Japanese gunners fought back fiercely. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the skies, and for a few moments, Yamato seemed to fight like a living beast. But sheer power and courage could not overcome numbers and precision. The US Navy had mastered the art of air warfare, and battleships, those symbols of the old world, were no match for it. One torpedo struck Yamato's port side, then another, then another. Her engine shuddered, her decks erupted in flames, and the ship began to list. Inside, sailors struggled to control flooding compartments, to save their ship, to defy fate itself. But the sea was relentless. Within hours, the pride of Japan had become a burning wreck. And then, as if in slow motion, Yamato capsized, her magazines detonated, and she vanished beneath the waves in a massive explosion that sent a column of smoke rising 6 kilometers into the sky. The shockwave could be felt for miles. Over 3,000 men went down with her. Only around 280 survived. The unsinkable had sunk. What sank Yamato was not just American firepower. It was the death of an era, the era of the battleship, the era of old strategies, and perhaps most tragically, the era of blind pride. The Japanese admirals had refused to see the world changing around them. They believed armor could defeat air power. They believed courage could overcome technology. And in doing so, they sent thousands of brave men to their deaths. But the story of Yamato is not merely a tale of destruction. It is a timeless reminder. It reminds us that no matter how mighty our creations, how proud our achievements, or how confident our assumptions, arrogance is always the first step toward downfall. The admirals of Japan believed they had built a symbol of invincibility. Instead, they built a monument to human overconfidence. Yet, even amid that tragedy, there was honor. The sailors of Yamato did not go down in despair. They went down serving their nation, believing they were protecting their homeland. History may judge the decisions of their leaders, but it cannot deny the courage of those men who faced certain death with unwavering resolve. Today, Yamato rests 1,000 feet below the East China Sea, silent, broken, and entombed in darkness. But her story continues to echo across generations. Every rusted gun and shattered hull plate tells us something profound, that power without wisdom is a fleeting illusion. For the United States, the sinking of Yamato symbolized not just victory, but the dawn of a new age, the age of air dominance and technological warfare. For Japan, it marked the closing chapter of its naval pride, and perhaps the humbling realization that no weapon, no matter how mighty, can stand against the relentless march of innovation. And for the world, it was a moment of awakening. The end of Yamato was not just the end of a ship, it was the end of an idea. So, when we look back at that April morning in 1945, we should not see only the flames or the sinking hull. We should see the lesson that rose from the sea, the lesson that even the greatest giants fall when they fail to adapt, when they fail to listen, when they mistake pride for strength. In every age, nations and leaders face the same temptation, to believe that what they have built cannot be challenged, that their power is beyond reach. Yamato teaches us that nothing, and no one, is beyond the reach of change. The ocean that swallowed Yamato is the same ocean that reflects our own humanity, our brilliance, our ambition, our arrogance, and our ultimate fragility. The admirals once boasted that Yamato was unsinkable, but as 300 American planes sent her to the bottom, the world learned an eternal truth: pride may build empires, but humility preserves them. Thank you. When the Imperial Japanese Navy began planning the construction of Yamato, it was not merely designing a battleship, it was crafting a statement of national power, pride, and destiny. The 1930s were an era when Japan saw itself as rising to challenge the Western powers that had long dominated the Pacific. Its leaders viewed the ocean not as a barrier, but as a vast field of opportunity, and in their minds, no instrument could better project that vision than the most powerful warship ever built. The decision to construct Yamato was born from both strategic necessity and emotional conviction. Japan's naval planners understood that they could never match the industrial might of the United States ship for ship. America could outproduce them in cruisers, destroyers, and aircraft carriers. Therefore, Japan's solution was to build fewer ships but make each one so overwhelmingly powerful that it could defeat multiple American opponents in direct combat. It was an audacious idea, wrapped in the dream of quality overcoming quantity. The Yamato was to be the manifestation of that belief, a single battleship capable of taking on an entire fleet. From the beginning, secrecy surrounded the project. Its blueprints were classified at the highest level, and even many within Japan's own military structure knew little about it. The ship was constructed in the core naval arsenal under an enormous cover, a massive wooden canopy built to hide her size from reconnaissance planes. Engineers worked tirelessly to realize a design that pushed the limits of naval architecture. Displacing nearly 72,000 tons at full load, Yamato would be the largest battleship ever built. Her main guns, 9 18.1-inch monsters, could fire shells weighing over 3,000 pounds, capable of penetrating any existing armor at ranges exceeding 25 miles. Her armor belt was so thick that it seemed impenetrable. Her decks were layered with steel meant to shrug off even the most powerful bombs. The very philosophy behind her construction was defensive invincibility paired with offensive terror. When Yamato was launched on December 16, 1941, only 8 days after the attack on Pearl Harbor, it seemed as though Japan had truly achieved something divine. She represented not only a new kind of ship but a national symbol of technological mastery. Her presence was meant to instill confidence in the Japanese people and dread in the hearts of Japan's enemies. To the admirals who oversaw her creation, she was proof that Japan could stand equal, or superior, to any Western nation. She was both a weapon and a message. The empire of the rising sun had reached its zenith. Inside Japan, the myth of Yamato quickly grew. She was named after the ancient name for Japan itself, Yamato, signifying not just power, but cultural essence and imperial destiny. Her name alone carried spiritual weight, tying the modern industrial marvel to Japan's mythic past. Newspapers spoke of her in awe, though the government carefully avoided revealing too much detail. To the public, she was a symbol of invulnerability, the iron heart of a nation destined for victory. That belief extended to the highest levels of military command. Admirals saw Yamato not as just a ship but as the embodiment of Bushido, the samurai spirit reborn in steel. She represented honor, sacrifice, and the unyielding will of Japan's naval tradition. Yet behind that gleaming image, cracks were already forming, both in the philosophy that created Yamato and in the world she was meant to dominate. By the time she entered service, the era of the battleship was already fading. The Battle of Taranto in 1940 and the devastating success of carrier-based aircraft at Pearl Harbor had proven that air power could render even the mightiest ships vulnerable. While Japan itself demonstrated this truth when its aircraft destroyed American battleships at anchor, its own admirals remained deeply attached to the doctrine of surface warfare. They saw Yamato as the ultimate expression of traditional naval might, dismissing the idea that fragile airplanes could ever replace the majesty and endurance of a battleship. In a sense, Yamato was a paradox. She was both a technological masterpiece and a relic the moment she was completed. Her creators had poured into her the best materials, the most advanced engineering, and the boldest imagination their nation could muster. but they had built her for a kind of war that was already passing into history. Even so, within Japan's military circles, faith in her invulnerability remained absolute. During trials, she performed magnificently. Her armor withstood all tests. Her massive guns fired with thunderous precision. The admirals watched her glide across the water with a sense of divine satisfaction, as though they had conquered the very limits of human craftsmanship. Her first commander, Captain Miyazato, wrote that standing upon her bridge felt like standing atop a mountain. The world seemed small from there, and that view reflected Japan's own mindset at the time. They saw themselves as masters of the Pacific, destined to shape history by their will and bravery. In the ship's design, there was more than military logic, there was national psychology. Yamato was Japan's answer to its inferiority complex against Western powers, a steel embodiment of their belief that courage and craftsmanship could overcome industrial disparity. It was not merely a weapon but a cultural statement. Japan would not bow, would not yield, and would not be surpassed. The ship's internal design was equally grand. Inside her hull were massive living quarters, state-of-the-art command systems, and an array of secondary weapons. She carried an entire floating city of sailors, engineers, gunners, and officers. For the men who served aboard her, Yamato was more than an assignment. It was an honor beyond words. They polished her decks with reverence and treated her as a sacred vessel. To many, she was an extension of Japan itself, a microcosm of their homeland floating in steel upon the sea. The daily routines aboard her reflected both military discipline and cultural devotion. Rituals were performed before major operations, and Shinto ceremonies were held to bless her voyages. The ship, the crew, and the empire were bound together by a shared illusion of immortality. However, as the war dragged on, the grand symbol of power spent most of its existence doing very little. Yamato was too valuable to risk. Japan's naval commanders, while proud of her, were also terrified of losing her. For years, she remained largely in port or used as a reserve force, her massive guns firing few shots in anger. This inaction became a symbol of Japan's strategic paralysis. The ship that was supposed to dominate the oceans instead became a burden, an asset too precious to deploy. Meanwhile, the tide of war shifted rapidly. America's industrial strength and technological adaptability overwhelmed Japan's static strategies. While American shipyards produced carriers and destroyers by the dozens, Japan struggled to even fuel its fleet. The irony was painful. Yamato had been built on the premise that Japan could never match America's quantity, yet her very existence drained resources that might have been better spent elsewhere. Her construction had consumed vast amounts of steel, manpower, and time. Every ton of metal that went into her hull was a ton not used for aircraft, submarines, or escort vessels. By the time she was finally called upon to fight, she was a symbol of magnificent futility, a giant designed for a world that no longer existed. Still, the myth persisted. In the hearts of Japanese sailors and citizens alike, Yamato remained untouchable. Propaganda films and wartime speeches invoked her name as a reassurance that Japan's spirit remained unbroken. When defeats mounted and islands fell, the image of Yamato gliding proudly through the seas offered psychological refuge. She was proof that Japan's craftsmanship and courage still mattered, even when reality was turning grim. Admirals continued to boast of her invulnerability, convinced that her sheer presence would one day turn the tide. What those admirals could not see, or refused to see, was that Yamato represented not progress, but denial. She was the physical embodiment of a nation clinging to the past, unable to accept that innovation and adaptation had replaced brute strength as the true measure of power. Her massive guns, once symbols of dominance, were now impractical in the face of aircraft that could strike from beyond her reach. Her heavy armor, once a source of pride, made her slow and vulnerable to torpedoes and bombs. Every feature that had made her magnificent also made her obsolete. Yet, despite this, there is something deeply human about the creation of Yamato. It shows how pride and hope can drive people to create wonders, even in the face of inevitable failure. The engineers who designed her believed they were building perfection. The workers who hammered her plates together did so with nationalistic devotion. The officers who commanded her believed that if any ship could change fate, it was this one. In their hearts, Yamato was not doomed, it was destined. As the years went by, the world came to see Yamato not only as a warship but as a metaphor. She symbolized Japan's rise, its ambition, its blindness, and ultimately its tragedy. When historians look back at her construction, they see more than steel and rivets. They see the psychology of a nation that tried to turn pride into armor. The ship's story begins not with battle, but with belief, the belief that something made by human hands could be perfect, indestructible, and eternal. And like all such beliefs, it was destined to be tested. In the end, Yamato's creation was both a triumph and a warning. It demonstrated what a nation could achieve through unity, discipline, and vision, but also how easily those same virtues could be consumed by pride. The ship that was built to secure Japan's glory became the vessel that would later carry its tragedy. Every bolt and beam reflected a dream too large for reality to sustain. Yamato was not just a battleship, it was Japan itself, magnificent and flawed, determined and doomed. By April 1945, the Empire of Japan was standing on the brink of collapse. The once dominant imperial navy had been shattered by years of relentless warfare. Its aircraft carriers lay at the bottom of the sea, its air wings were decimated, and its fuel reserves were nearly exhausted. The empire that had once swept triumphantly across the Pacific now faced encirclement. The Allies were closing in, and the invasion of Okinawa, just 340 miles from the Japanese mainland, marked the final stage before the home islands themselves would be attacked. The Japanese military leadership knew the end was near, yet they were bound by a code that refused surrender. In this atmosphere of desperation and fatal pride was born one of the most tragic and symbolic missions of the entire war, Operation 10, Go, the final voyage of Yamato. Yamato was no longer a secret weapon by 1945. The Americans knew of her existence and power through intercepted communications and aerial reconnaissance. Yet she had done little to justify her myth. For years she had remained anchored, her massive guns silent, while the war's tide turned against Japan. But as the Allies advanced toward Okinawa, Japanese admirals sought one last display of strength, something to rally the spirit of the nation and show that Japan's warrior ethos remained unbroken. The idea for Operation 10 Go emerged not from strategic logic, but from emotional desperation. It was conceived less as a military plan and more as an act of symbolic sacrifice, a final offering of honor to the emperor and the nation. The plan in its brutal simplicity was this: Yamato, escorted by a handful of smaller vessels, would sail from Japan to Okinawa, where she would fight to the death against the American invasion fleet. Since Japan had virtually no air cover left, the ship's commanders knew that Yamato would almost certainly be destroyed long before reaching the island. She carried only enough fuel for a one-way journey. Once she reached Okinawa, she was to beach herself and serve as a stationary fortress, firing her massive guns until destroyed. Every man aboard knew that he would not return. It was a mission of certain death. When the order was issued, there was a brief silence among the officers. Some were stunned, others quietly accepted it as fate. Admiral Seiuchi It, who commanded the operation, initially resisted the idea. He argued that sending Yamato without air support was meaningless, a waste of men and material. But Japan's naval leadership, driven by a mixture of pride and fatalism, overruled his objections. They insisted that it was better to die gloriously than to sit idle while the empire crumbled. The Yamato would sail as a symbol of Japan's undying resolve. To refuse was to dishonor the very ideals the ship represented. In the end, Admiral It bowed to his duty. On April 6, 1945, Yamato prepared for her final voyage. In the early hours, the ship's crew assembled on deck. Many had tears in their eyes, others stood silently, their faces pale but resolute. Before departure, a Shinto ceremony was held. Priests blessed the ship and her men, and messages of loyalty were read aloud. Some sailors wrote farewell letters to their families. Others took photographs together, smiling faintly as if to hide the fear that pressed upon their hearts. The youngest among them were barely 19 years old. When the anchor was raised, Yamato's massive engines rumbled to life, and the great ship glided slowly out of Tokuyama harbor, her gray hull gleaming under the morning sun. Accompanying her were one light cruiser Yohoji and 8 destroyers, small and vulnerable compared to the behemoth they guarded. The mission had begun. The men aboard Yamato knew the truth. Their destination was death, but not a meaningless one in their eyes. Japanese wartime propaganda had long glorified self-sacrifice as the ultimate virtue. Dying for the emperor and the nation was considered the highest honor a man could achieve. To the sailors, the thought that they were part of a final, heroic gesture gave them a grim kind of pride. They were the living embodiment of the Yamato Demashi, the spirit of Japan. As the ship cut through the waves, its bow cleaving the dark sea, there was an air of eerie calm. The sky was clear, the ocean vast, and the men went about their duties with quiet precision. Some sang softly, others wrote their last thoughts in diaries that would never be read. But the Americans were ready. Allied codebreakers had long since deciphered Japan's communications, and the departure of Yamato was detected almost immediately. U.S. reconnaissance planes tracked her progress as she moved southward, and the American command prepared a devastating reception. They would not allow Yamato to reach Okinawa. Instead of engaging her with ships, they would send an armada of aircraft, hundreds of planes from multiple carrier groups, to destroy her from the sky. On the morning of April 7th, Yamato was about 200 miles north of Okinawa when she was spotted by a U.S. scout plane. The news raced through the American fleet, enemy battleship sighted. Within hours, the largest aerial strike in naval history up to that point was launched. More than 300 planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters roared into the sky. The mission was to annihilate the pride of the Imperial Navy. At 2:30 p.m., the first American aircraft appeared on Yamato's radar. The ship's sirens wailed as sailors ran to battle stations. The calm of the voyage was shattered by the shriek of alarms and the clatter of anti-aircraft guns being loaded. As the enemy planes descended, the sky erupted into chaos. Bombs and torpedoes rained down and the sea around Yamato boiled with explosions. The ship's anti-aircraft gunners fought furiously, filling the sky with flak. Many U.S. planes were hit, some spiraling into the sea, but there were simply too many attackers. The first wave of torpedoes struck Yamato's port side, tearing open her armor and flooding her lower decks. The great ship shuddered violently but continued forward, her gunners still firing defiantly. Then came another wave and another. Torpedoes smashed into her hull, bombs crashed onto her deck, and fires spread across her superstructure. The smoke was so thick that men could barely breathe. The ship began to list heavily to port. Inside, engineers and damage control teams struggled desperately to counterflood compartments and keep her upright. The order came to reverse engines, but the damage was too great. Power failed in several sections, communication lines went dead, and the giant vessel slowed almost to a stop. Admiral It remained calm on the bridge, even as the situation grew hopeless. Officers begged him to abandon ship, but he refused. All hands fight to the end, he ordered. Below decks, men continued to load shells into the big guns, though they had no clear target. Others fought the fires with buckets of water, coughing and choking in the smoke. Some wrote quick prayers on scraps of paper and tucked them into their clothing. As the list increased, the ship's decks became slippery with oil and blood. Dozens were thrown overboard by explosions. The escort ships around Yamato were also being torn apart. The light cruiser Yahagi was hit repeatedly and soon sank, taking most of her crew with her. By 200 p.m., Yamato was mortally wounded. At least a dozen torpedoes and 8 heavy bombs had struck her. Water poured into her hull faster than any pump could handle. The order to abandon ship was finally given, though it came too late for most. Sailors scrambled over the sides, jumping into the burning sea as explosions rippled through the ship. Some were dragged down by the suction of the sinking vessel, others were consumed by flames or killed by secondary blasts. At 1:23 p.m., one of Yamato's forward magazines detonated. The explosion was so enormous that it split the ship in two, sending a mushroom cloud of smoke towering nearly 20,000 feet into the air. The shockwave rolled across the ocean like thunder, and then, within minutes, the pride of Japan was gone, swallowed by the sea. Out of a crew of over 3,000 men, only about 280 survived. Most of those were pulled from the oily waters by the few destroyers that managed to escape. They watched as the waves closed over the spot where Yamato had vanished, taking with her the hopes and illusions of an entire generation. Admiral It went down with his ship, along with most of his officers. His last recorded words were calm and stoic: "We have done our duty. Operation Tengo was over. The mission had achieved nothing militarily. It had not reached Okinawa, had not damaged the enemy, and had not altered the course of the war." Yet in Japan, it was remembered not as a failure but as a tragic act of nobility. Newspapers and radio broadcasts hailed Yamato's final voyage as the ultimate expression of Japanese courage. The government portrayed it as a glorious sacrifice for the emperor, a proof that the spirit of the nation remained unbroken even in defeat. But for those who understood the reality, it was a catastrophe born of arrogance and desperation. It was the inevitable result of leaders who could not face the truth that their empire was lost. The story of Operation Tengo is one of the most haunting in military history because it encapsulates the collision between honor and futility. The men who sailed on Yamato were brave beyond question, but their bravery was wasted in service of a doomed cause. Their deaths accomplished nothing except to add another tragic chapter to the long list of wartime sacrifices made in vain. In their courage, there was beauty. In their fate, there was tragedy. The ocean that swallowed them also swallowed the last dream of the Imperial Navy. When historians look back at that final voyage, they see more than a naval engagement. They see the symbolic end of Japan's imperial ambition. Yamato's sinking marked the death of the belief that courage and tradition could triumph over technology and reason. The greatest battleship ever built had gone to sea without air cover, without fuel for return, and without hope of success. She was sacrificed not for victory, but for pride. Operation Tengo stands as a solemn reminder that sometimes nations choose glory over survival, and in doing so, they find both lost beneath the same waves. The story of Yamato's destruction is not just the story of a single ship's demise, it is the story of a profound transformation in the art of war. For centuries, naval supremacy had been measured in tons of armor, inches of gun caliber, and the number of battleships that a nation could float. The battleship was the ultimate symbol of power, a fortress at sea, a nation's pride made manifest in steel. Yet, by the time Yamato sailed into battle for the last time, the world had already moved into a new era. The age of the battleship was ending, and the age of air power had begun. The clash between Yamato and the US carrier planes was more than a military engagement. It was the dramatic moment when one era of warfare yielded to another. In the early 20th century, naval warfare revolved entirely around the battleship. The launching of HMS Dreadnought in 1906 revolutionized naval architecture and triggered an arms race among the world's powers. Every major nation sought to build bigger, faster, and more heavily armed ships. Japan, eager to secure its place among the great powers, joined the race with unmatched fervor. Battleships were not merely tools of war, they were instruments of prestige. To possess the largest and most powerful fleet was to command respect on the world stage. This belief dominated naval thinking for decades, and it shaped the philosophy that produced Yamato. Japan's naval doctrine before World War II centered on what it called the decisive battle strategy. The idea was simple but deeply ingrained. When war inevitably came with the United States, Japan would lure the American fleet across the Pacific, wear it down with submarines and small surface attacks, and finally destroy it in one climactic battle between capital ships. This concept was inspired by the victory at Tsushima in 1905, when the Imperial Japanese Navy annihilated the Russian fleet in a single decisive encounter. Japan's admirals believed history would repeat itself. They saw the battleship as the key to that triumph, the weapon that would decide the fate of nations in a single day. But while Japan clung to that doctrine, the world was changing. The airplane, once dismissed as a fragile novelty, was becoming a weapon of astonishing potential. The interwar years saw the development of carrier aviation, and navies began experimenting with how to project air power at sea. The United States and Britain invested heavily in aircraft carriers and naval aviation training, while Japan itself developed some of the world's best carrier pilots and aircraft in the 1930s. Ironically, it was Japan's own stunning success at Pearl Harbor in 1941 that proved the supremacy of air power over battleships. In a single morning, carrier-based aircraft from 6 Japanese carriers crippled the U.S. Pacific Fleet, sinking or disabling 8 American battleships without a single ship-to-ship engagement. The lesson should have been clear even then: the future of naval warfare belonged to the sky. Yet Japan's high command did not fully accept what that meant. They saw Pearl Harbor not as a vindication of carrier power, but as a temporary advantage. Their strategic heart remained loyal to the battleship, the visible, tangible embodiment of might. Yamato and her sister ship, Musashi, were designed under that lingering faith. They were conceived as unstoppable juggernauts that could crush any opponent in direct combat. What the admirals failed to grasp was that the very battlefield on which they expected to fight had changed. As the war progressed, American strategy evolved rapidly. The U.S. Navy embraced the aircraft carrier not as a support vessel but as the centerpiece of its naval power. The Fast Carrier Task Force concept transformed how fleets operated. Mobility, range, and air dominance replaced armor and gun range as the decisive factors. Carriers could strike hundreds of miles away, long before an enemy battleship could even bring its guns to bear. Planes became the new artillery shells: faster, more flexible, and infinitely more devastating. The results were decisive. At the Battle of Midway in 1942, Japan lost 4 of its front-line carriers and most of its best pilots in a single engagement. The loss crippled its ability to wage offensive war. Yet even after that disaster, Japanese strategists continued to believe that their battleships could still play a vital role. Yamato and Musashi were seen as the last hope for turning the tide. But the American carriers, now growing in number and sophistication, dominated the Pacific. Each engagement reinforced the reality that ships without air cover were helpless targets. When Musashi, Yamato's sister ship, met her fate in 1944 during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, it was already clear that the battleship era was ending. She was attacked by nearly 300 American planes and sunk after receiving more than 20 torpedo and bomb hits. Her immense armor and guns availed her nothing. The same fate awaited Yamato a few months later. In both cases, the mightiest warships in the world were destroyed by aircraft, machines smaller than one of their gun barrels but infinitely more versatile. The sinking of Yamato by 300 U.S. planes on April 7, 1945 was the final undeniable proof of the new order. No fleet of battleships could have withstood what Yamato faced that day. The air attacks were relentless, precise, and coordinated. Dive bombers crippled her communications and fire control systems. Torpedo bombers targeted her weak points with ruthless efficiency, and fighters strafed her decks, suppressing anti-aircraft fire. Every advantage that Yamato's designers had painstakingly built into her, the thickness of her armor, the range of her guns, the discipline of her crew, was rendered useless by an enemy she could not reach. Her main guns, capable of hurling shells over 25 miles, could not even target the aircraft that attacked her from above. She was a weapon built for a world that no longer existed. The contrast between Yamato's massive power and her helplessness that day was symbolic of the transformation in global warfare. It was not merely a technological change but a philosophical one. The battleship represented human control, visible power, and the belief that strength lay in direct confrontation. Air power, by contrast, was elusive, impersonal, and abstract. It represented distance, speed, and the dominance of strategy over spectacle. The airplane had turned the ocean from a surface battlefield into a 3-dimensional arena. It was no longer about who could build the biggest gun, but who could strike first and from the farthest distance. This shift had profound implications beyond naval combat. It marked the beginning of the modern era of warfare, where technology and innovation began to outweigh tradition and heroism. For Japan, which built its military doctrine on notions of bravery, sacrifice, and the samurai spirit, this was a devastating realization. The courage of Yamato's crew could not overcome the technological superiority of the American fleet. Their valor was real, but valor alone could not stop bombs falling from the clouds. The war had moved from the realm of individual courage to that of industrial and scientific mastery. The United States had mastered the art of coordinated air-sea operations. By combining radar reconnaissance and carrier-based squadrons, they could locate and destroy enemy fleets before they ever came within gun range. Battleships became obsolete not because they lacked power, but because they lacked reach. The most expensive and heavily armed ships in the world were now vulnerable to aircraft that cost a fraction of their price. It was a revolution in efficiency, an inversion of the old logic that size and cost equaled strength. Even as Yamato sank beneath the waves, the lessons of her destruction were already shaping the post-war world. The age of air power did not end with World War II, it expanded. Nations realized that control of the skies meant control of the battlefield. The carrier replaced the battleship as the centerpiece of naval might, and air forces became the decisive arm of every major power. The legacy of Yamato was thus both tragic and transformative. Her death marked the birth of the modern military age, Yet, for all its strategic clarity, the transition was emotionally painful. The battleship had been more than a machine. It was a symbol of human pride, craftsmanship, and courage. Watching it rendered obsolete by fragile aircraft felt, to many, like watching the end of an era of heroism. The men who had spent their lives mastering the art of naval gunnery and command were left behind by a generation that mastered engines, wings, and radio waves. The thunder of big guns gave way to the roar of propellers and, later, the scream of jet engines. In Japan, the loss of Yamato was mourned not just as a military defeat but as a cultural one. The battleship had embodied the ideals of endurance, discipline, and loyalty, the very essence of the nation's spirit. Its sinking was not only the fall of a ship but the symbolic death of those ideals in the face of a changing world. The American pilots who destroyed her were not samurai. They were professionals, guided by radar and mathematics, representing a new kind of warrior, the technician soldier. The age of glory had been replaced by the age of calculation. Still, there was an undeniable beauty in the transformation. The shift from battleship to air power reflected humanity's relentless drive to innovate, to adapt, to overcome the limits of old thinking. It was the story of progress written in smoke and steel. The aircraft carrier became the new capital ship, a floating airfield capable of projecting force across oceans. Battleships would linger for a few more years, but their days of dominance were over. When Yamato sank, she took with her not just her crew and her guns, but the very idea that might could be measured in armor and caliber. In the decades that followed, even as nations built jet aircraft and nuclear submarines, the shadow of that transformation remained. The lesson of Yamato, that technology and adaptability triumph over size and tradition, became a guiding principle of modern warfare. It was not simply that air power had defeated sea power, it was that innovation had defeated complacency. The sky had become the new ocean, and the airplane the new battleship. When historians reflect on the Pacific War, the image of Yamato engulfed in flames beneath the assault of American planes stands as one of its defining moments. It captures in a single scene the collapse of the old world and the rise of the new. The greatest battleship ever built was destroyed not by an equal opponent, but by weapons from above, small, fast, and agile. It was the ultimate demonstration that the future belongs not to those who boast of strength, but to those who embrace change. And so, the clash between air power and battleship power was not merely a battle for control of the Pacific, it was a battle for the soul of warfare itself. The skies won, and with them, the course of history was forever altered. When we examine the tragedy of the Yamato, we are compelled to look beyond steel, guns, and aircraft, and into the realm of human decision-making, the fatal flaw that often brings down empire's arrogance. The story of Yamato is not merely about the destruction of a ship, it is a tale of pride clouding judgment, of leaders who mistook prestige for power, and of a nation so caught in the myth of its invincibility that it ignored the changing tides of war. The sinking of Yamato was, in many ways, not an unavoidable catastrophe but a predictable outcome of arrogance disguised as courage, of honor misinterpreted as strategy. The seeds of this hubris were planted long before Yamato ever touched the water. Japan's imperial navy, shaped by the victory at Tsushima in 1905, grew up believing it was destined for greatness. The stunning defeat of the Russian fleet at Tsushima gave Japan an intoxicating sense of superiority, a belief that courage, discipline, and sheer willpower could overcome even the most formidable enemies. That victory, though remarkable, created a dangerous illusion that persisted for decades, the illusion that Japan's spirit and traditions made it unconquerable. By the time World War II erupted, that belief had hardened into dogma. Japan's military leaders saw themselves as heirs to a divine mission. They spoke of Yamato Damashi, the spirit of Japan, a code of loyalty and sacrifice that they believed could triumph over material odds. When they commissioned Yamato in 1937, they did not merely build a warship, they built a floating shrine to their own ideology. Every decision about the ship's design reflected this mindset. She was to be the biggest, the strongest, the most impregnable battleship the world had ever seen. Her main guns were the largest ever mounted on a warship, and her armor was so thick that no known shell could penetrate it. Japanese admirals convinced themselves that by sheer size and craftsmanship, Yamato could dominate any battlefield. But while Japan poured its limited industrial resources into a handful of colossal ships, the United States invested in aircraft carriers, radar, and logistics, the technologies that would define the new age. Japanese leadership, however, refused to recognize this shift. Even after the devastating success of the Pearl Harbor attack, when carrier planes had proven their supremacy, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though personally a believer in air power, was still pressured by traditionalists who worshipped the battleship. These men could not accept that the vessel they had glorified for decades had become obsolete. The arrogance of the Imperial Navy was institutional. Senior officers came from an elite, insulated caste who valued appearance and honor over innovation and practicality. Dissent was discouraged, questioning authority was seen as weakness. Young officers who proposed new doctrines or questioned outdated tactics were often ignored or silenced. This rigid hierarchy steeped in the samurai ethos left little room for flexibility. Thus, even as Japan's fleet was being destroyed by air power in battle after battle, from Midway to late Gulf, many admirals continued to believe that their super battleships could restore Japan's lost glory. By 1945, Japan was already facing inevitable defeat. Its cities lay in ruins, its economy was shattered, and its navy had been largely annihilated. Yet, even in the face of these realities, pride refused to yield to pragmatism. When the Yamato was ordered to make her final sortie in April 1945, Operation 10 Go, it was not a strategic decision but a symbolic one. The ship was to sail to Okinawa, fight until her ammunition was spent, and then beach herself to become an unsinkable gun platform. In essence, it was a suicide mission. There was no air cover, no hope of success, and no rational justification. It was an act born of desperation and arrogance, a gesture meant to preserve honor rather than achieve victory. Admiral Tsuchiya, who commanded Yamato on her final voyage, initially opposed the mission. He knew it was futile. He understood that without air support, Yamato would be an easy target for American planes. Yet under pressure from Tokyo, he relented. The leaders of the Imperial Navy insisted that Yamato must die gloriously, a sacrifice that would inspire the nation. It was a decision soaked in fatalism and pride, the kind of decision that mistakes symbolism for strategy. The same leaders who had once boasted that Yamato was unsinkable were now sending her to certain destruction, clinging to the illusion that death in battle was preferable to surrender. This mindset, where pride overrules reason, was not unique to Japan, but it was particularly destructive in this context. The belief that honor demanded sacrifice blinded Japan's military leadership to the realities of modern warfare. They saw the act of fighting itself as more important than the outcome of the fight. They believed that even defeat, if honorable, would somehow preserve the nation's dignity. But dignity does not rebuild cities or feed starving civilians. Pride does not win wars, it destroys those who serve it. The American commanders, in contrast, approached warfare with cold pragmatism. They had learned through bitter experience that adaptability, not pride, wins battles. The US Navy was guided by data, intelligence, and strategic flexibility. When Yamato was detected leaving the inland sea, American reconnaissance planes tracked her movements in real time. The decision to attack was made swiftly and efficiently. There was no drama, no speeches about honor, just calculation and execution. The contrast between the two sides could not have been sharper, one driven by emotion and ideology, the other by logic and precision. As Yamato sailed south, her officers and crew knew they were going to die. Many of them reportedly wrote farewell letters to their families before departure. Some carried small shrines or photographs of loved ones. On board, there was an eerie calm, a grim acceptance that this was the end. To them, dying aboard Yamato was not a tragedy but a duty. They had been taught from birth that death for the emperor was the highest calling. The leadership's arrogance had instilled in them a fatal sense of loyalty, one that glorified death over survival. When the attack came, wave after wave of American aircraft raining bombs and torpedoes, there was no miracle, no heroic turnaround. Yamato's anti-aircraft guns fired desperately, but it was hopeless. The ship that had been called unsinkable was torn apart in less than 2 hours. Her magazine exploded with a force so great that it was seen 100 miles away. Over 3,000 men perished, only about 270 survived. It was the single greatest loss of life aboard any warship in history. And for what? No strategic objective was achieved, no victory was gained, no difference was made in the outcome of the war. It was a meaningless sacrifice. The ultimate expression of hubris turned to ashes. The Japanese high command, upon hearing of Yamato's destruction, offered the usual rhetoric of honor and bravery. But beneath the ceremonial words, there must have been the sting of realization their pride had doomed their greatest creation. They had sent thousands of men to die for an illusion, the illusion of invincibility. The same arrogance that had built Yamato had also destroyed her. In a broader sense, Yamato's fate mirrored that of Japan itself during World War II. The nation's leadership was consumed by delusions of grandeur. They believed they could stand against the industrial and technological might of the United States, a nation with resources beyond anything Japan could match. Instead of recognizing their limitations and seeking a diplomatic end to the conflict, they doubled down on pride and ideology. They believed that Japan's divine destiny would compensate for material disadvantage. This belief led to the ruin of cities, the suffering of civilians, and the deaths of millions. The arrogance of leaders who refused to admit failure prolonged the agony of an entire nation. Leadership failure often comes not from ignorance but from the refusal to learn. The Japanese admirals were not unintelligent. They were trapped in their own myth. They clung to a vision of warfare that had already passed into history. They mistook past glory for present capability. The lessons of Pearl Harbor, Midway, and Late Gulf were before them, yet they refused to adapt. Their minds were armored as heavily as their ships, resistant to change, impervious to reason. And so Yamato became both a monument and a tomb, a monument to human ambition, and a tomb for those destroyed by it. Her story stands as a timeless reminder of what happens when leadership becomes inflexible, when arrogance replaces analysis, and when pride blinds nations to reality. Great powers fall not only because of enemies, but because of their own illusions. The admirals who boasted that Yamato was unsinkable were not defeated by superior guns, but by superior minds, by leaders who understood that progress cannot be stopped by pride. The cost of arrogance is always greater than its defenders believe. For Japan, that cost was the loss of an empire, the devastation of its homeland, and the deaths of millions of its people. For Yamato, it was the transformation from symbol of glory to symbol of futility. The world watched as the mightiest ship ever built was consumed by flames. A spectacle both terrible and instructive. Her destruction taught a lesson that echoes far beyond her time in war. As in life, arrogance is not strength. It is the prelude to defeat. The legacy of the Yamato is far more profound than the story of its destruction. Though the battleship lies beneath the waves of the East China Sea, its spirit endures as one of the most powerful symbols of war, technology, and human ambition. The name Yamato itself carries meaning that transcends steel and fire. It was an ancient name for Japan, evoking the nation's cultural heart and soul. When the ship was built, it represented more than military might. It embodied national identity, pride, and hope. Yet as history unfolded, Yamato came to symbolize something very different: the consequences of misplaced faith in strength, the tragic cost of arrogance, and the inevitability of change. Its legacy remains a haunting echo in the annals of human history, a reminder that even the mightiest creations of humankind can become tombstones for their own creators' dreams. When Yamato was conceived in the late 1930s, Japan stood at the crossroads of ambition and insecurity. The world was witnessing rapid industrial growth, technological revolutions, and rising tensions among great powers. Japan, eager to assert itself as an equal to the Western empires, viewed the building of Yamato as an assertion of sovereignty and technological mastery. The ship was meant to send a message that Japan could not only match the naval power of the West but surpass it. Every rivet, every plate of armor, every turret was a declaration of national pride. To the Japanese people, Yamato became a living symbol of their nation's greatness. It represented resilience, unity, and divine purpose. Propaganda elevated the ship to near mythical status. Posters, newspapers, and films celebrated her as the protector of the empire and the unsinkable guardian of the emperor. For a time, the myth seemed to work. Even as Japan faced growing setbacks in the Pacific, Yamato remained a beacon of hope, a belief that the empire still possessed an invincible weapon that could change the course of the war. But as with all myths built on illusion, the truth eventually surfaced. The Yamato's destruction exposed not only the vulnerability of the ship, but also the fragility of the ideology it represented. When she went down, taking with her over 3,000 men, it was not merely the loss of a vessel, it was the collapse of a national dream. The Yamato's sinking was a moment of collective reckoning for Japan, one that stripped away the illusions of invincibility and forced a nation to confront the reality of modern warfare and its own limitations. Yet, paradoxically, in her death Yamato achieved a different kind of immortality. She became not just a relic of defeat but a symbol of endurance. In post-war Japan, the story of Yamato transformed from one of pride and loss to one of reflection and identity. It came to represent the tragedy of war itself, the waste of human potential and the futility of blind nationalism. Her legacy began to evolve into a cautionary tale, a mirror through which generations could examine the cost of arrogance and the necessity of peace. For many Japanese citizens, the memory of Yamato became intertwined with the nation's post-war journey. The ship's fate paralleled Japan's own transformation, from militaristic empire to pacifist nation, from conqueror to contributor, from destroyer to rebuilder. The ruins of the ship, lying silently beneath the sea, became a metaphor for rebirth. Out of the ashes of war, Japan rebuilt itself not with battleships and guns but with innovation, diplomacy, and perseverance. The lessons of Yamato became the lessons of modern Japan. That strength is not measured by armor, but by wisdom, that the power to destroy is far less valuable than the power to create. In a broader historical context, Yamato's legacy extends beyond Japan. For military historians and strategists, it marks a turning point, the end of the battleship era and the dawn of modern warfare dominated by air and later, nuclear power. The Yamato and her destruction demonstrated a simple, eternal truth: no weapon, however mighty, is immune to obsolescence. The obsession with building the biggest, or the strongest, can blind nations to the realities of innovation and change. It was a lesson not only for Japan but for every power on Earth. The same principle applies even today, in an age of drones, missiles, and artificial intelligence, technologies that evolve faster than doctrines can adapt. The fate of Yamato serves as a warning to those who mistake size for superiority and tradition for progress. But there is another, more human side to Yamato's legacy, one that speaks not of technology or strategy but of people. The men who served aboard her were not symbols, they were sons, fathers, brothers, and friends. Many were barely out of their teens, drawn from all corners of Japan, filled with the same pride and fear that accompany young soldiers in every war. They believed they were serving a noble cause. The fact that so many of them perished in vain underscores the tragedy of war's human dimension, the waste of life in service of political and ideological delusion. Today, memorials to Yamato honor not the machinery of war, but the humanity of those who died. Their sacrifice reminds us that every ship, every tank, every weapon is ultimately manned by human beings whose lives are far more precious than the instruments of destruction they command. In the decades following the war, Yamato became an object of fascination for writers, filmmakers, and scholars. Books and documentaries explored her design, her missions, and her destruction in meticulous detail. Yet beyond the technical discussions, there was a deeper yearning, a desire to understand how something so magnificent could end in such futility. This fascination speaks to a universal human theme, the allure of greatness and the inevitability of downfall. In the Yamato, people saw a reflection of themselves, the ambition to reach for glory and the pain of confronting failure. In 1980, the film Yamato brought the story to a new generation, portraying not just the might of the ship but the humanity of its crew. Later, the animated series Space Battleship Yamato reimagined the vessel as a futuristic arc that saves humanity, turning tragedy into hope. These cultural reinterpretations show how the Yamato's story evolved over time, from a wartime symbol of dominance to a post-war emblem of peace and redemption. The ship that once represented imperial ambition was reborn in popular imagination as a vessel of salvation, carrying the message that humanity must learn from its mistakes and strive toward a future free of destruction. In that sense, Yamato's legacy is dual. It warns and inspires. It warns against the perils of unchecked pride, the blindness of leadership, and the futility of war. But it also inspires resilience, the ability of nations and individuals to rise after catastrophe, to rebuild and redefine themselves. The same spirit that once built Yamato into a weapon of war later built Japan into a nation of peace and progress. The ship's memory, once associated with destruction, became intertwined with the idea of transformation. For historians, Yamato represents a paradox. She was both a masterpiece of engineering and a monument to failure. Her construction displayed the height of human ingenuity. Her destruction revealed the limits of that ingenuity when guided by flawed vision. The paradox remains timeless. Human beings are capable of extraordinary creation, yet often use that ability for self-destruction. In this way, Yamato is not merely a relic of Japanese history but a universal symbol of the human condition, a reflection of how greatness and tragedy often coexist. Even now, 80 years after her sinking, divers and researchers continue to explore the Yamato wreck. Each artifact retrieved from the seabed, each helmet, piece of armor, or personal belonging, tells a story. These remnants are not trophies but testaments, reminders of lives lost and lessons learned. They lie in silence, untouched by time, speaking a truth that outlives generations, that no power built on arrogance can endure, and no loss born of courage is ever meaningless if remembered. The legacy of the Yamato also lives on in how nations approach power in the modern world. Military strength remains necessary, yet the lesson of the battleship's demise urges caution against overconfidence. The true measure of national greatness lies not in weapons, but in wisdom, empathy, and restraint. Yamato teaches that the pursuit of peace requires as much courage as the pursuit of war, and that the mightiest victories are those that prevent battles, not those that win them. In many ways, the story of Yamato is a mirror for our age. As new technologies emerge, cyber weapons, artificial intelligence, autonomous drones, the temptation to believe in invincible systems returns again and again. But every generation must remember that there is no such thing as an unsinkable ship, no unbreakable wall, no undefeatable force. The ocean of history is littered with the wrecks of civilizations that believed otherwise. The lesson of Yamato endures precisely because it speaks not only to the past but to the future. Today, Yamato is no longer a weapon of war but a silent teacher. She lies in eternal rest beneath the sea, her great hull slowly embraced by coral and sediment, her guns stilled forever. Yet her story continues to resonate across time, not as a monument to destruction but as a plea for understanding. Every ripple above her grave carries the whisper of her lesson that pride must yield to humility, that technology must serve humanity, and that the true strength of a nation lies not in the size of its weapons but in the depth of its wisdom. The Yamato's legacy, then, is not one of defeat but of enlightenment. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of war and see the patterns that lead to tragedy, to recognize the fragile balance between power and responsibility. Her fall reminds us that progress without perspective is perilous, and ambition without morality is ruinous. In the end, the Yamato teaches what all great tragedies teach, that even in destruction there can be meaning, and from the depths of failure, humanity can rise wiser, gentler, and stronger than before. Ladies and gentlemen, picture the frozen fields of Belgium in December 1944. The Battle of the Bulge is raging, the largest and bloodiest battle fought by American forces during World War II. Amid snow, smoke, and shattered trees, the U.S. Army is stretched thin, struggling to hold back Hitler's last desperate offensive. Yet amidst the gunfire and confusion, another kind of war was being waged, not with tanks or rifles, but with deception, disguise, and cunning. This is the story of how German infiltrators, dressed in stolen American uniforms, driving captured American jeeps, and speaking fluent English, nearly threw the Allied front into chaos, and how a simple question about baseball, asked by sharp-minded U.S. military police, helped uncover one of the most daring deception operations in modern warfare. As the German army launched its surprise attack in the Ardennes, Adolf Hitler knew that brute force alone would not be enough. The Allies were too strong, too entrenched. So, he turned to an unorthodox plan called Operation Grief, led by the ruthless and brilliant SS Commando Otto Skorzeny. This operation would send specially trained German soldiers behind American lines disguised as GEs. Their mission: create confusion, change road signs, misdirect convoys, spread false orders, capture bridges before they could be destroyed. In short, turn the very order of the U.S. Army against itself. To pull this off, Skorzeny recruited English-speaking Germans. Some had lived in America before the war. Others learned English from movies, books, or even captured soldiers. They studied U.S. slang, military habits, and radio codes. They memorized American songs, practiced chewing gum, and even learned how to casually say, "Hey buddy, what's cookin'?" When these infiltrators rolled out in captured jeeps wearing genuine US uniforms, they looked the part. They sounded the part. And for a few chaotic days, they were the part. The effect was immediate and devastating. American convoys were misdirected into ambushes. Bridges that were supposed to be defended fell into German hands. Military communications turned into a maze of mistrust. Commanders began to doubt even their own men. There were stories of US troops turning back friendly units, afraid they might be disguised Germans. Officers demanded to see identification papers, passwords, and even challenge each other with trivia questions about American life. The paranoia ran deep. General Omar Bradley himself was detained for a short time by suspicious soldiers. General Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, was placed under heavy guard because of credible threats that the infiltrators planned to kidnap or assassinate him. Roadblocks sprang up across Belgium and northern France. Every soldier was subject to questioning. Every accent, every hesitation, every uncertain answer could mean capture or worse. The battlefield had become not only a fight for territory, but a psychological war, a test of loyalty and identity. And it was here at these freezing roadside checkpoints that the US military police began to get clever. They realized that these German imposters could mimic American speech but not American culture. They could copy the uniform but not the spirit behind it. So, the MPs began to ask questions. Questions that only a true American would answer instinctively. Questions that drew not from military manuals, but from baseball diamonds, movie theaters, and high school classrooms. Who won the World Series last year? What's the capital of Illinois? Who plays center field for the Yankees? For a genuine GI, the answers were second nature. For a German officer who had spent his life in Bavaria or Berlin, they were a nightmare. Some stammered, some guessed, others tried to change the subject. And just like that, the facade cracked. One famous account tells of a German posing as an American lieutenant, confidently driving through a checkpoint until an MP casually asked, "Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend?" The soldier hesitated. Too long. A real American would have said Minnie, without a thought. He was arrested on the spot. Slowly, methodically, the US military police began to expose the infiltrators. The more they uncovered, the deeper the panic had run. Dozens of Germans were captured and several were executed as spies. Scorsini's plan, brilliant in theory, began to unravel under the weight of American resilience and intuition. But the chaos he unleashed lingered. It took weeks before the Allies could fully restore trust in their ranks. The suspicion and confusion had slowed troop movements and communications at a critical point in the Battle of the Bulge. And for that, Operation Grafe, though ultimately a failure, had achieved part of its purpose. Yet what remains most striking about this episode is not just the deception, but the revelation of what truly defines identity in war. The German infiltrators had every physical marker of being American: the uniform, the weapons, the vehicles, even the swagger. But what they lacked was the spirit, the lived experience of American life, the shared memory of baseball games on summer nights, of jokes and songs and small cultural touchstones that bind the people together. It wasn't superior firepower or military discipline that uncovered them. It was the heartbeat of a nation. It was a soldier's instinct, a cultural code invisible to the enemy, but known to every farm boy from Kansas, every dock worker from Brooklyn, every factory hand from Detroit. This story reminds us that war is not only fought on the battlefield. It is fought in the mind, in the realm of identity, memory, and belonging. The Germans could counterfeit the outer image of the American soldier, but not his heart. They could steal the flag on his shoulder, but not the meaning behind it. And in that moment, when a simple question about baseball helped reveal a spy, it became clear that what unites a nation is not its uniform, but its shared story. So today, as we remember the Battle of the Bulge and the brave men who fought through that winter of fear and deception, we also honor those unsung heroes, the military police officers who trusted their wits as much as their weapons. Men who knew that a question about the Yankees or Mickey Mouse could save lives. Men who proved that even in the fog of war, truth has its own language. The German infiltrators caused chaos. They sowed confusion and doubt. But in the end, it was the quiet confidence of ordinary American soldiers, their humor, their culture, their unshakable sense of who they were, that defeated deception. Because sometimes, the sharpest weapon in war is not a rifle or a grenade, it's knowing your own story so well that no enemy can ever pretend to be you. Thank you. In the winter of 1944, when the war in Europe seemed to be reaching its closing chapter, Adolf Hitler unleashed one last desperate gamble: the Ardennes Offensive, better known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Allies had liberated France. Paris had fallen back into friendly hands, and the German army appeared to be retreating on every front. Yet in Hitler's mind, there was still a path to victory, or at least to a negotiated peace that could split the Allies apart. To achieve that, he knew brute force would no longer suffice. The German army was battered, exhausted, and short on fuel and supplies. What it needed was surprise, ingenuity, and deception. From this dire strategic corner was born one of the most audacious and unconventional operations of the entire war. Operation Grief, a plan that weaponized disguised confusion and psychological warfare. Hitler chose for this mission one of his most trusted and daring officers, SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny was already a legend within the ranks of the Third Reich. Earlier in the war, he had led the spectacular rescue of the imprisoned Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from a mountaintop hotel in 1943, a mission that earned him both the admiration of Hitler and the reputation of being Germany's most dangerous commando. If anyone could execute a plan as risky and intricate as Operation Grafe, it was Skorzeny. He had a reputation for thinking unconventionally. He saw war not merely as a clash of armies, but as a chess game of deception, psychology, and shock. The concept behind Operation Grafe was as simple as it was sinister. Create chaos behind American lines by sending German soldiers dressed in captured US uniforms, driving captured American vehicles and speaking fluent English. Their objectives were not primarily to engage in combat but to sabotage communications, misdirect troop movements, switch road signs, seize key bridges, and spread panic. If executed successfully, the operation could cripple the American response to the Ardennes offensive, buying the German army precious days or even weeks to push forward. For Hitler, this deception was more than a tactical move. It was a psychological strike meant to fracture the Allies' confidence and sow distrust among their ranks. Skorzeny immediately began recruiting men for his new unit, which would be designated the 150th Panzer Brigade. The selection process was not easy. The mission required soldiers who could not only fight but also blend seamlessly into the ranks of the US Army. That meant fluency in English, familiarity with American slang, customs, and behavior. Out of thousands of applicants, only a small number met the basic language requirement. Many had studied English in school, but few could master the nuances of casual conversation or the cultural subtleties of an American GI. The challenge was immense, yet Skorzeny pressed forward. He knew that even a few convincing infiltrators could create disproportionate havoc. The German High Command began scouring the battlefield and supplied depots for captured American uniforms, weapons, and vehicles. They found hundreds of sets of clothing from fallen or captured soldiers. They even repainted German vehicles to resemble American jeeps and armored cars. Workshops buzzed with activity as mechanics and tailors worked around the clock to make the disguises believable. The soldiers trained extensively on American drills: how to salute correctly, how to wear helmets and gear, how to chew gum, smoke cigarettes, and use the right expressions. They practiced saying things like buddy, jeep, and okay until it came naturally. Some even memorized names of US towns, baseball teams, and movie stars to sound authentic if questioned. They were schooled in US military insignia so they could recognize the ranks and act accordingly. As December approached, Skorzeny's men were ready, or as ready as they could be for a mission that almost guaranteed capture or death. The operation began alongside the main German offensive on December 16, 1944. The infiltrators, dressed as US soldiers, slipped through the fog and snow, moving behind enemy lines in captured jeeps. Their success depended on the element of surprise and the general confusion of the battlefield. The timing could not have been better. The suddenness of the German attack had thrown Allied communications into disarray. Amid the winter storm, front lines were blurred, and the roads clogged with troops, vehicles, and refugees. In that chaos, Skorzeny's disguised teams found the perfect cover. Almost immediately, their work began to bear fruit. Using falsified identification and fluent English, they set up roadblocks, gave false orders, and redirected traffic. Some deliberately sent entire American units down the wrong roads, causing delays in reinforcements reaching the front. Others switched road signs so that advancing US tanks found themselves moving toward enemy territory. In several instances, infiltrators managed to cut telephone lines, disrupt supply convoys, and even capture small bridges before retreating. The psychological damage far outweighed the actual physical destruction. Rumors spread quickly through the ranks that the Germans had American spies everywhere, that no one could be trusted, and that even officers giving orders might be imposters. This psychological warfare achieved precisely what Skorzeny had intended. It shattered trust within the Allied command structure. Soldiers began to question each other's identities. Patrols hesitated at checkpoints. Entire units were delayed because officers demanded extra verification before moving. General Omar Bradley, one of the most senior US commanders, was reportedly detained for questioning by his own men because of fears that German agents were impersonating officers. Even General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, was placed under heightened security after intelligence suggested that Skorzeny's commandos planned to assassinate or kidnap him in Paris. Allied headquarters went into partial lockdown, and Eisenhower's movements were restricted for several days. Such measures may seem excessive, but they underscore how deeply Operation Grafe had penetrated the Allied sense of security. While Skorzeny's unit was small, only a few dozen actual infiltrators managed to get behind enemy lines. The idea of disguised enemies multiplied their effect 100-fold. Every unexplained incident, every misdirected convoy, every rumor of sabotage was attributed to them. The fear of invisible infiltrators disrupted operations far more effectively than any single act of sabotage could have. In this way, deception itself became a weapon of war, a psychological instrument that amplified confusion, slowed decision-making, and eroded confidence. For days, the Allies struggled to determine how many infiltrators were at large. Military police units established strict checkpoints across Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. Every soldier passing through had to answer questions, show identification, and sometimes recite details about American life, questions designed to trap imposters. The atmosphere was one of suspicion and anxiety. There were reports of American soldiers shooting at each other by mistake, convinced the other party was a disguised enemy. In one tragic instance, a soldier hesitated to open fire on an approaching jeep, thinking it was friendly. It turned out to be one of Skorzny's teams, and the hesitation cost lives. The fog of war had thickened into paranoia. However, deception as a weapon has its limits. Despite early success in spreading confusion, Operation Grafe suffered from the same logistical problems that plagued the rest of the German army at that stage of the war. The infiltrators lacked sufficient English-speaking personnel, and their supply of authentic American uniforms and vehicles was small. Moreover, once the Allies realized what was happening, the element of surprise was lost. The military police adapted quickly, devising clever cultural tests, asking about baseball teams, state capitals, and movie stars that no amount of language training could prepare the Germans for. As one MP remarked later, you can fake an accent, but you can't fake a childhood. In total, fewer than 50 of Skorzny's men made it far enough behind the lines to carry out missions, and most were captured within days. Many were executed as spies under the Geneva Conventions, since fighting in the uniform of the enemy was considered a capital offense. Yet despite its small scale, Operation Grafe left an indelible mark on the psychology of the Allied forces. It demonstrated how a well-planned deception could momentarily paralyze a vastly superior enemy. Even after the infiltrators were captured, the fear of their presence lingered for weeks, influencing command decisions and slowing the Allied advance. In this sense, the operation succeeded far beyond its material results. It exploited the human mind as the true battlefield. What makes this story so compelling is how it illustrates the dual nature of deception in warfare. On one hand, it is a tool of immense power, a way to amplify limited resources, to turn the enemy's own order and discipline against them. On the other hand, it carries moral and practical risks. Once deception becomes widespread, it corrodes trust not only between enemies but within one's own ranks. The Allies' experience in the Ardennes showed how easily suspicion could spread, how quickly soldiers could begin doubting their comrades. In this sense, Operation Grafe succeeded in creating not just temporary confusion, but a deeper psychological disruption, a reminder that in modern warfare, the line between friend and foe can be frighteningly thin. The story also reveals the extraordinary lengths to which nations will go when cornered. Germany, facing inevitable defeat, invested manpower and precious resources in an operation that relied more on cunning than strength. For Hitler, it was a symbolic gesture, a final attempt to reclaim the strategic initiative through audacity and imagination. For Skorzny, it was an experiment in modern warfare, one that blended espionage, commando tactics, and psychological manipulation. Though ultimately unsuccessful in altering the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge, it anticipated the kinds of unconventional warfare and intelligence operations that would define much of the Cold War that followed. Disinformation, infiltration, and the use of disguise as a tactical advantage would become standard elements of global conflict. Deception has always been a shadow companion to military power. From the wooden horse at Troy to the fake armies and inflatable tanks used by the Allies before D-Day, history is filled with examples of how illusion can triumph where force fails. Operation Grafe stands as one of the most daring examples of this principle in action. It showed that even in an age dominated by tanks, planes, and artillery, a well-crafted lie could still shake an empire's foundations. It proved that warfare is not only a contest of weapons but of minds. And perhaps the greatest lesson of all is that deception's power lies not merely in its ability to mislead, but in its capacity to make people doubt what they know to be true. For a few tense days in December 1944, thousands of Allied soldiers found themselves asking, who can I trust? That question, more than any bullet or bomb, was Skorzny's real weapon. In the bitter cold of the Ardennes forest during December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge raged on, the front lines of war were no longer drawn by trenches or tanks alone. They ran through the hearts and minds of soldiers. The Germans had launched their last great offensive, and in the midst of the chaos came a new kind of warfare, one that tested not just the strength of armies but the very essence of identity. The Allied soldiers, especially the Americans, found themselves confronting enemies who looked and sounded exactly like them. These were German infiltrators, expertly disguised as US GIs, who had been trained to blend into the ranks, to move undetected through checkpoints, and to spread confusion among the troops. Their existence created a deep sense of paranoia across the battlefield. In such an atmosphere, uniforms, passwords, and even fluent English were no longer enough to prove loyalty. What emerged as the ultimate defense was something less tangible but infinitely more powerful: cultural identity. When the first reports reached American command that Germans dressed in US uniforms were misdirecting convoys and sabotaging supplies, disbelief quickly gave way to alarm. The idea that the enemy could infiltrate the very heart of the American lines was terrifying. Soldiers began to question everyone: officers, comrades, and even friends. A man's accent, his way of walking, or the way he tied his shoelaces could be grounds for suspicion. The battlefield became a theater of uncertainty, and the most dangerous weapon was doubt itself. Out of necessity, the US military police had to devise a method of separating the real from the fake. They realized quickly that documents could be forged, passwords could be learned, and even mannerisms could be imitated. What could not be imitated, however, was the lived experience of being American. The MPs began to test this idea by asking seemingly ordinary questions, questions that no spy could study for, no manual could prepare for, and no briefing could anticipate. They asked soldiers about baseball teams, state capitals, movie stars, and hometown trivia. These were questions that came from the rhythm of American life, from shared culture rather than formal education. To someone raised in the United States, the answers were instinctive. To an infiltrator who had learned English in a classroom or from captured soldiers, they were traps set with invisible tripwires. A wrong answer, a moment's hesitation, or even the wrong tone of voice could betray a man. One of the most famous questions asked during this time was, who won the World Series last year? For an American GI, the answer came instantly: the St. Louis Cardinals. Baseball was more than just a sport. It was woven into the cultural fabric of American life. A soldier from Kansas or New York didn't have to think twice about it. But to a German pretending to be American, the question was a linguistic minefield. Even if he knew the team names, he might not know how to pronounce them properly or recall the emotional connection Americans had to the game. The same went for questions about movie stars or comic characters. Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? Was one of the simplest and most devastatingly effective questions asked. The correct answer, Minnie, was something every American child knew instinctively. But for a German trained in military English, the question made no sense. It came from a world of Saturday morning cartoons and comic strips, not from army handbooks or textbooks. The use of such cultural questions was not merely clever. It revealed something profound about what it means to belong to a nation. The Germans had tried to counterfeit the outward signs of American identity: the uniform, the vehicles, the slang. They could imitate the salute, the swagger, and even the casual friendliness of US soldiers. But they could not counterfeit the essence of being American, the shared cultural memory, the everyday references, the small details that form the invisible thread of a nation's life. These were not facts that could be memorized. They were habits of the heart, accumulated through years of living within a particular society. They came from childhood memories, from games played in the backyard, from radio broadcasts and Sunday newspapers, from conversations over dinner tables. That was what the German infiltrators could never truly reproduce. As the days of the Battle of the Bulge wore on, the effectiveness of these cultural tests became evident. American MPs began stopping every vehicle, interrogating drivers and passengers with casual but probing questions. The method was simple, but it worked with astonishing reliability. At one checkpoint, a suspicious officer asked a man claiming to be an American sergeant, "What's the capital of Illinois?" The answer came hesitantly, "Chicago." Instantly, the man was arrested. Any true American would have said Springfield, without hesitation. At another checkpoint, an MP asked, "Who plays center field for the Yankees?" The suspect stumbled, trying to recall a name he'd memorized, and that hesitation was enough. One German infiltrator, caught off guard by the question about Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, could only stare blankly before muttering something about not watching cartoons. His cover was blown. These moments were more than clever interrogations. They were symbolic. They showed that American identity, even in the midst of war, was rooted in something deeper than military discipline or uniformity. It was grounded in a shared cultural language, a way of seeing and talking about the world that was uniquely American, the US. Soldiers were bound together not just by their flag or orders, but by the things they collectively knew and loved: baseball, Hollywood, comic books, jazz, small-town life, and a certain easy humor that no training camp could teach. Culture became a line of defense as strong as any trench or machine gun. The psychological impact of this realization was immense. It reassured the soldiers that despite the chaos, there was still a way to distinguish the real from the counterfeit. It restored a measure of confidence and control to a situation where both had been slipping away. For the MPs, each successful identification of an infiltrator was not just a tactical victory, it was a moral one. It reaffirmed that the enemy could mimic appearances but not authenticity. The Germans could copy the outer shell of American life, but not the soul within it. What made this strategy even more remarkable was how spontaneous it was. There had been no prior doctrine or training manual for dealing with infiltrators disguised as friendly troops. The MPs, operating under extreme pressure and confusion, had to improvise. They understood instinctively that culture was more reliable than paperwork. In a sense, they turned everyday American life into a secret code, one that only genuine Americans could decode naturally. This innovation reflected the adaptability and resourcefulness that defined US forces throughout the war. Where others relied on rigid procedure, Americans often relied on creativity and intuition, traits born out of a society that valued individuality and quick thinking. The deeper significance of this episode lies in what it reveals about the relationship between culture and identity. In times of peace, culture is often taken for granted. It's the background noise of daily life, the unspoken assumptions everyone shares. But in times of crisis, culture becomes the glue that holds people together. It becomes a measure of belonging. The Battle of the Bulge, with its cold and confusion, turned culture into a weapon of recognition. The ability to name a baseball team or recall a cartoon character became a test of national authenticity, a password into the shared consciousness of America itself. This episode also highlights a striking contrast between the two sides of the war. The Germans, for all their efficiency and discipline, treated identity as something that could be engineered. They believed that appearance, language, and behavior could be copied with enough training. The Americans, by contrast, demonstrated that identity is not a surface construct, but a deeply rooted system of meaning. It is lived rather than learned. This difference reflected the broader ideological divide between the two nations. Nazi Germany emphasized uniformity, control, and imitation of an ideal. America emphasized diversity, spontaneity, and authenticity. In that sense, the MP's use of cultural trivia to expose spies was not just a practical tactic. It was a statement about what America represented. The soldiers who manned those checkpoints in the snow did more than protect supply lines. They defended the intangible essence of their nation. Every time an infiltrator stumbled over a baseball question or failed to name Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, it was a small triumph for authenticity over imitation. It was proof that what made Americans distinct could not be stolen, copied, or faked. Their culture, casual, playful, diverse, and deeply internalized, was an armor stronger than steel. As the Battle of the Bulge continued and the tide turned against the Germans, the infiltration threat gradually diminished. Most of Scorsini's men were captured or killed, and Operation Grey faded into legend. But the legacy of those tense days remained. Military planners would later study the episode as an example of psychological warfare and counterintelligence. They would note how, in a world where appearances could deceive, the truest form of verification came not from paperwork but from personality. The baseball questions, the movie trivia, the small talk about home, these became symbols of a nation's inner unity. What happened on those icy roads in 1944 still resonates because it reminds us that identity is more than uniform or speech. It is the collective memory of a people. In the end, it was not superior technology or firepower that exposed the infiltrators. It was a shared understanding of who Americans were and what they valued. That sense of cultural belonging turned into a living defense mechanism. It transformed ordinary knowledge of sports, geography, and entertainment into a weapon of truth. The story of the MPs and their questions is therefore not just a tale of wartime cleverness. It's a profound commentary on human society. It shows that while enemies can copy the outer forms of culture, they cannot replicate the emotional depth and authenticity that come from living it. For the Americans, that authenticity was their greatest safeguard. It meant that even in a war of shadows and disguises, where trust was fragile and deception rampant, there remained a core of identity that no enemy could penetrate. War has often been described as a clash of strength, armies pitted against one another in contests of firepower, courage, and endurance. But in December 1944, amid the bitter cold and fog of the Ardennes forest, the United States Army discovered that war could also be a contest of wit. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last desperate offensive of the Second World War, became more than a physical struggle for territory. It evolved into a psychological battlefield, where victory depended not just on the might of tanks or artillery, but on the clarity of mind and alertness of the men who fought. When German infiltrators disguised as American soldiers began operating behind Allied lines, the power of awareness and intelligence became the most vital weapon of all. The infiltration operation, known as Operation Grave, was the brainchild of Otto Scorsini, a man already famous for his daring rescue of Benito Mussolini. His plan was audacious and sinister: train German commandos to speak English, dress them in captured American uniforms, and send them behind Allied lines to sow confusion. They would change road signs, give false orders, misdirect reinforcements, sabotage supply routes, and disrupt communication networks. If successful, this plan could cripple the American response to the German offensive and extend the war. It was deception at its most sophisticated, an attempt to weaponize confusion itself. When news spread that Germans dressed as American soldiers were moving freely behind Allied lines, it ignited a wave of suspicion that swept across the front. Soldiers began questioning everyone they met. Identification papers were checked repeatedly, passwords changed hourly, and patrols set up roadblocks on every major route. The battlefield had become an environment where even a friendly face could hide an enemy. In this climate, the American soldiers learned to depend on more than just orders. They had to think, to observe, to question, and to trust their instincts. The US military police, responsible for maintaining order and security, found themselves at the center of this chaos. Their task was daunting. They had to identify infiltrators who looked exactly like American GIs, drove American Jeeps, and spoke English convincingly enough to pass casual inspection. These imposters carried authentic-looking papers and insignia, leaving the MPs with no reliable method of detection. Yet the soldiers on those snowy roads did not panic. They adapted. They began to rely on something far more subtle and human than any document: awareness. Awareness, in its true sense, is not merely seeing what lies before the eyes, it is perceiving what lies beneath the surface. The MPs began to look for the small things: the hesitation before a response, the unnatural confidence in a stranger's tone, the slight mispronunciation of a common word, or the improper way of saluting. They noticed that some supposed American soldiers used expressions that didn't quite sound right, or they failed to understand slang that any real GI would know. These were tiny details, invisible to anyone not paying attention, but to those who were alert, they became telltale signs of deceit. But awareness alone was not enough. The Americans needed a way to test these suspicions quickly and decisively. That is where wit, the weapon of the mind, came into play. The MPs began asking spontaneous questions that drew from everyday American knowledge, from popular culture and sports to local geography and politics. These questions had nothing to do with military procedure. Instead, they tapped into the shared experiences that no German could easily fake. Who won the World Series last year? What's the capital of Illinois? Who plays center field for the Yankees? These might seem trivial, but in the confusion of war, they became as effective as a loaded rifle. A true American could answer without a second thought. A German, however fluent in English, would falter. This use of quick thinking and cultural awareness reflected something profound about the American soldier. Unlike the rigidly trained and hierarchical armies of Europe, the US Army prized adaptability. Its soldiers came from diverse backgrounds: farmers, factory workers, students, mechanics, and teachers, each bringing a unique perspective and a capacity for independent thought. They were used to solving problems on their feet, thinking for themselves, and questioning when things didn't seem right. This flexibility became a defining strength. The Americans were not fighting from rote memory, they were reasoning, observing, and adjusting. It was this spirit of self-reliant intelligence that made them nearly impossible to deceive for long. The famous example of an MP asking, "Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend?" illustrates this perfectly. The question was playful, almost absurd in a military setting, but it was brilliant in its simplicity. Every American child knew the answer: Minnie Mouse. To a German spy, however, it was an enigma. There was no way to anticipate such a question, no way to study for it. It was an expression of culture, of familiarity with the small, seemingly insignificant details that bind a people together. The soldier who thought to ask it displayed a kind of battlefield creativity that no amount of training manuals could produce. His quick thinking, born of instinct and experience, became as decisive as any weapon. The power of awareness and wit also extended beyond the checkpoints. It influenced how soldiers responded to confusion and misinformation. German infiltrators had tried to redirect convoys by changing road signs, leading some units toward enemy territory. But American troops soon learned to question every order that seemed inconsistent. Drivers began verifying destinations. Patrol leaders double-checked maps and coordinates. Instead of blindly following directions, soldiers used logic and observation to assess whether something made sense. Awareness became their shield against manipulation. The ability to think critically, to ask, "Does this order fit what I know?" saved countless lives. It is striking to note how this emphasis on intelligence and individual awareness contrasted with the German approach. The German army, built on obedience and hierarchy, relied heavily on precision and order. Its soldiers were trained to follow commands without hesitation, to trust authority implicitly. Scorsini's plan exploited that predictability by assuming his infiltrators could use the same authority-driven system against the Americans. But the US Army's culture of questioning and initiative turned that assumption upside down. American soldiers, encouraged to act on their own judgment, were harder to deceive because they were not conditioned to accept things unthinkingly. This difference in mindset, obedience versus curiosity, played a decisive role in undermining the German plan. The MPs, meanwhile, became masters of psychological warfare themselves. They turned the Germans' own tactics against them. By spreading rumors that they were aware of the infiltrators, and that any suspect could face immediate execution, they made the disguised Germans more nervous, increasing the chances of mistakes. At checkpoints, MPs observed body language as much as answers. A confident liar might pass with words but not with eyes. Fear, hesitation, or overcompensation often gave them away. The Americans understood that warfare was not just about weapons. It was about people, behavior, and psychology. As more infiltrators were captured, the MPs grew bolder and more inventive. They began asking region-specific questions. What's the capital of your home state? What team does Joe DiMaggio play for? What's the nickname of the University of Michigan's football team? Each question added a layer of cultural depth that no spy could easily replicate. The interrogations became less about facts and more about feeling. A real American's answers came with emotion, rhythm, and familiarity. A fake's answers were mechanical, cautious, and too careful. In this way, awareness and wit evolved into an art form, an invisible battle of intelligence between those who sought to deceive and those determined to expose them. But awareness was not only reactive, it was also preventive. The discovery of infiltrators taught American soldiers the value of vigilance in all things. They learned to notice inconsistencies, to cross-check details, and to communicate clearly under stress. Awareness became ingrained in their conduct. They realized that survival depended as much on perception as on bravery. This lesson would influence the US military long after the war ended. The ability to think critically under pressure became a hallmark of American military training, reflecting the lessons learned in those icy forests, where a moment's doubt could mean disaster. The impact of this mental sharpness went beyond military success. It reinforced a sense of confidence among the troops. Once the infiltrators were exposed and the threat understood, the soldiers began to feel a renewed sense of control. They recognized that the enemy's greatest weapon, confusion, could be neutralized by intelligence and composure. In a war where technology and machinery often overshadowed the human element, it was reassuring to realize that the human mind remained the most powerful tool of all. In retrospect, the story of the American MPs during Operation Grafe stands as a powerful reminder that awareness and wit are not luxuries in warfare. They are necessities. The soldiers who manned those checkpoints were not scholars or detectives. They were ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Yet through observation, quick thinking, and presence of mind, they turned an impossible situation into a manageable one. They demonstrated that even in a world of deceit, the ability to reason and to see beyond appearances can make the difference between defeat and victory. The German infiltrators, for all their training, never understood that deception works best against those who are unaware. Against alert and questioning minds, its power fades. The Americans' greatest advantage was not superior intelligence, gathering equipment, or secret codes. It was their ability to think on their feet, to improvise, to adapt. Awareness turned ordinary soldiers into guardians of truth. Wit turned everyday knowledge into a weapon. Ultimately, the episode serves as a lesson far beyond the battlefield. It reminds us that awareness and intelligence are the first lines of defense in any form of conflict, whether on the front lines of war or in the everyday battles of life. The soldiers of the Battle of the Bulge showed that courage is not only about facing danger, but also about perceiving it clearly and responding with clarity of mind. Awareness sharpens instinct. Wit turns uncertainty into opportunity. In those freezing December nights, surrounded by deception, the Americans proved that even when the enemy wears your uniform, speaks your language, and drives your vehicles, the truth can still prevail if you are smart enough to see it.